The room went silent the moment the camera zoomed in on the cockpit. My brother dropped his beer. My mother covered her mouth. My father leaned forward so quickly that his recliner nearly tipped. And for the first time in years, nobody said a word. On the television screen, the announcer's voice echoed across the living room. Leading today's demonstration flight is Major Emily Parker. My name, my face, my aircraft. Broadcast live to millions of Americans. The same brother who had called me the family failure stared at the screen as if he'd seen a ghost. The same parents who had spent years defending him couldn't look away. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke, because the pilot flying across the sky wasn't some stranger. It was me, the daughter they'd overlooked, the sister they'd underestimated, the woman they'd stopped believing in years ago. And the strangest part? I had never lied to them. Not once. They simply never cared enough to ask. But to understand how we got there, you have to go back long before the television cameras. Back before the Air Force. Back before the uniforms. Back before the air shows. Back to a small town in Texas. Back to the day my brother's dream became my burden. And eventually, my future. My name is Emily Parker. I'm 34 years old now. But this story really began when I was a little girl growing up outside Wichita Falls, Texas. Back then, everybody knew who Jake Parker was. Jake was my older brother. 3 years older. 3 years louder. 3 years more confident. And according to nearly everyone who knew us, 3 years more talented. If there was a baseball game, Jake was the star. If there was a school event, Jake got attention. If there was a family gathering, relatives asked about Jake first. I wasn't ignored exactly. I was simply second. Second place becomes familiar when you're the younger sibling of someone everybody expects great things from. The funny thing is that I adored him. I really did. When I was 7 years old, I wanted to wear the same baseball cap he wore. When I was 10, I copied the way he talked. When I was 12, I followed him around so much that he started calling me his shadow. Most little sisters probably understand that feeling. The desire to be included. The desire to belong. The desire to hear an older sibling say they were proud of you. Back then, Jake was my hero. And Jake had one dream. Flying. He loved airplanes. Loved them. Our bedroom walls were covered with aircraft posters. Fighter jets, bombers. Military aviation magazines stacked everywhere. Air shows were practically holidays in our family. Every summer, Dad loaded us into the truck before sunrise. We'd drive for hours just to watch military aircraft roar across the Texas sky. Jake would stand there with his eyes locked on the horizon, completely mesmerized. One year after watching an F-16 demonstration team perform, he turned to Dad and said something I'll never forget. "One day that'll be me." Dad smiled. "I believe it." Mom smiled too. So do I. Nobody laughed. Nobody doubted him. Not for a second. And honestly, neither did I. Because Jake had the kind of confidence that made other people believe. As we got older, the dream only grew. Jake joined Civil Air Patrol, earned flight experience, studied aviation constantly. Everything in his life pointed toward becoming a military pilot. My high school teachers talked about him like he was already destined for greatness. The future seemed written. Then reality arrived. It arrived quietly, in the form of a medical examination. I was 15 when it happened. Jake was 18. I remember the day he came home. No excitement. No smile. No celebration. Just silence. The kind of silence that tells you something important has broken. Dad sat with him at the kitchen table for hours. Mom cried. Nobody explained anything to me. Not immediately. I eventually learned the truth. Jake had failed a medical qualification required for the flight path he wanted. Not because he lacked intelligence, not because he lacked skill. His body simply didn't meet the standard. Years of dreaming ended in a single appointment. Just like that, the Air Force dream disappeared, and something inside Jake disappeared with it. The months afterward were difficult, harder than anyone expected. Jake became angry, then withdrawn, then bitter. Not all at once, slowly. Like watching a storm gather in the distance. At first everyone understood, even me. Losing a dream hurts, especially when you've built your identity around it. Mom and Dad became protective, extremely protective. Every conversation revolved around Jake. Every family decision revolved around Jake. Every concern revolved around Jake. Again, I understood, at least initially. But over time, something changed. The family didn't just comfort him. They began excusing him. Everything. His temper, his attitude, his mistakes, his complaints. No matter what happened, the explanation was always the same. He's been through a lot, and he had. But eventually that explanation became permission. Permission to stay angry. Permission to blame others. Permission to stop moving forward. Meanwhile, life kept moving, including mine. One afternoon while helping Dad clean the garage, I found an old aviation magazine. The cover featured an Air Force pilot climbing into a fighter jet. I stared at the image for several minutes. Something stirred inside me. The same feeling Jake used to talk about. The same excitement. The same fascination. That night, I started researching military aviation. Quietly. Secretly. I never told anyone. Not even Jake. Especially not Jake, because by then I already knew how he'd react. The dream belonged to him, not me. At least that's what everyone seemed to believe. Years passed. I graduated high school, worked hard, stayed focused, made plans. Whenever I talked about military service, Jake rolled his eyes. Whenever I talked about aviation, he laughed. The first time he called me the family failure, I was 21. We were sitting around the dinner table. I had just mentioned applying for officer training. Jake smirked. That's ambitious. Dad looked uncomfortable. Mom stared at her plate. I ignored the comment. Then Jake laughed. You've always been the family failure, Emily. Silence. Nobody corrected him. Nobody defended me. Nobody said a word. The silence hurt more than the insult, because silence can sound a lot like agreement. I looked around the table. My parents avoided eye contact. Jake leaned back in his chair, satisfied. And that's when I learned an important lesson. Sometimes the people who should protect you simply don't. Not because they don't love you, because they're too busy protecting someone else. I never argued, never fought back, never demanded fairness. I simply smiled and kept moving forward. Because while my family was still focused on the dream Jake lost, I was quietly preparing to chase it myself, and none of them had any idea how far I was willing to go. The first time I sat in the cockpit of a military training aircraft, I thought about my brother. Not because he was there. He wasn't. Not because he supported me. He didn't. I thought about him because I knew I was sitting inside the dream he had wanted his entire life. And for a brief moment I felt guilty. That feeling didn't last long. Reality has a way of pushing sentiment aside, especially when you're trying not to fail. When people imagine military flight training, they often picture excitement, speed, adventure, the kind of scenes you see in movies. The truth is much less glamorous. Most days were exhausting. Long hours. Constant evaluations, endless studying, pressure that never seemed to disappear. I joined the Air Force shortly after college. At first, nobody in my family took it seriously. Mom assumed it was temporary. Dad thought I'd eventually come home. Jake laughed outright. How long before you quit? I remember that question clearly. We were standing in my parents' driveway. The Texas sun was setting. I'd just finished loading my luggage into the trunk of my car. I looked at him. I'm not quitting. He shrugged. We'll see. That was it. No good luck. No encouragement. No brotherly support. Just doubt. The strange thing is that by then I'd become accustomed to it. Low expectations are surprisingly easy to carry once you've carried them long enough. Military life changed me quickly. Not because it made me tougher, because it forced me to discover how tough I already was. The first year was difficult. Really difficult. There were moments I questioned everything. Moments when failure seemed more likely than success. The standards were demanding. The competition was intense. Everyone around me had talent. Everyone around me wanted the same opportunities. Nobody cared about excuses. Nobody cared about your feelings. Results mattered. Performance mattered. Discipline mattered. And I loved it. For the first time in my life, nobody compared me to Jake. Nobody saw me as somebody's little sister. Nobody viewed me through the lens of family history. I was simply Emily Parker. Responsible for my own success. Responsible for my own failures. It was strangely liberating. One evening during training, I found myself sitting alone outside the barracks. The sun had disappeared. The air was cool. Several aircraft were parked in the distance. Their silhouettes stood against the darkening sky. I remember staring at them for a long time, thinking about home, thinking about family, thinking about the version of myself everyone back in Texas still believed existed. The family failure. The girl who would never accomplish much. The girl nobody worried about because she wasn't the important one. It struck me then how strange life can be. The people who know us longest don't always know us best. Sometimes they become attached to an old version of who we were, even after we've changed, even after we've grown, even after we've become someone entirely different. Boo. Meanwhile, Jake remained the center of gravity back home. At least according to my parents. Every phone call followed the same pattern. Mom would spend 20 minutes talking about Jake, his job, his frustrations, his latest problem, his newest plan. Then she'd ask about me, briefly. Not intentionally, not maliciously, just habit. Years of family dynamics are hard to break. One Christmas I returned home on leave. The visit lasted 4 days. By the second evening, Jake had already found a way to mock my career. We were sitting in the living room watching football. A commercial featuring military aircraft appeared on television. Jake pointed toward the screen. "Remember when I wanted to do that?" Nobody answered. He looked at me. "I guess somebody had to settle for second place." Mom laughed nervously. Dad cleared his throat. Nobody challenged him. Again. I sat quietly. Again. The silence no longer surprised me. What surprised me was how little it hurt. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped needing their approval. Not completely, but enough. Enough to keep moving. Enough to stay focused. Enough to understand that their opinion wasn't my future. The irony was that Jake himself had inspired my love of aviation. I don't think he ever realized that. When we were kids, I followed him everywhere. Air museums, aviation shows, books about fighter jets, flight simulators. Every interest he loved eventually became something I loved too. The difference was simple. When his path closed, he stopped walking. When mine became difficult, I kept going. That wasn't because I was stronger. It was because by the time I started, I already knew nobody was coming to save me. Nobody was going to carry me. Nobody was going to lower the standards. The responsibility belonged to me. And somehow that made all the difference. So, several years passed. My career advanced steadily. I earned qualifications, completed advanced training, accepted increasingly challenging assignments. Each accomplishment felt meaningful. Not because anyone back home noticed, because I knew how hard I'd worked for it. Success feels different when you've earned it quietly. There's no applause, no celebration, no audience, just private satisfaction. The knowledge that you kept your promises to yourself. One afternoon, I received a call from my mother. The conversation began normally. Weather, family news, small-town gossip. Then she casually mentioned Jake. "He's been having a rough time lately." I wasn't surprised. There always seemed to be something. "What happened?" "Work isn't going well." I listened. As always. Then she sighed. "You know, your brother had such big dreams." The comment wasn't intended to hurt me, but it did. Because I realized something. Even after all these years, my family still viewed Jake as the dreamer. The one with potential. The one whose future mattered. Meanwhile, I was actively living the life he'd once wanted. And somehow they still didn't see it. Not because I hid it. Because they never looked. A few months later, everything changed. I was stationed at an Air Force base in Nevada when the email arrived. At first, I assumed it was routine. Another administrative notice. Another scheduling update. Something ordinary. Instead, it contained an invitation. An opportunity. The kind of opportunity military aviators spend years hoping for. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time. My hands were shaking slightly by the time I finished. Because the selection board had chosen me for something extraordinary. Something prestigious. Something that would place me on a national stage. For several minutes, I simply stared at the screen, unable to process it. Then I thought about Jake, about my parents, about every family dinner where I'd been overlooked, about every joke, every dismissal, every moment of silence, and for the first time I wondered what would happen if they ever discovered who I had become. For most of my career, I believed success would feel dramatic. I imagined some life-changing moment, a celebration, a speech, a crowd applauding. Instead, one of the biggest moments of my life happened in a quiet office while I sat alone in front of a computer screen. No audience, no music, no fanfare, just an email, and a future I never saw coming. Sot. I must have read the message 10 times, maybe more. The words never changed. Neither did the outcome. I had been selected for one of the most prestigious aviation demonstration assignments in the Air Force. The selection process was brutally competitive. Outstanding pilots from across the service applied. Most never made it. Many applied more than once. Some spent years hoping for the opportunity. And somehow my name had ended up on the list. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the window. Aircraft moved across the flight line outside. Maintenance crews worked beneath the Nevada sun. Everything looked exactly the same. But nothing felt the same. Because after years of quiet effort, somebody had noticed. Somebody had looked beyond evaluations and flight hours and seen potential. The realization was overwhelming. Not because I needed validation, because I'd spent so many years without it. That evening I called my parents. Part of me wanted to share the news. Part of me still hoped. Even after all those years, even after all the disappointments, there is something inside most daughters that never fully stops wanting their parents to be proud. Mom answered on the second ring. We exchanged the usual greetings, talked about weather, neighbors, family updates. Then I told her, I got selected for something important. Oh, there was genuine interest in her voice. I smiled. One of the biggest opportunities of my career. That's wonderful, honey. For a moment I felt encouraged. Then she asked, did I tell you Jake is thinking about changing jobs? And just like that, the moment disappeared. Not because she meant to hurt me, because old habits are powerful. The conversation drifted back toward Jake, as it always seemed to. 20 minutes later, we hung up. I sat staring at my phone. Not angry, not even disappointed, mostly resigned. I understood my family by then. The rules rarely changed. The following months became some of the busiest of my life. The new assignment required additional preparation, additional training, additional responsibilities. The standards were higher. The expectations were higher. Everything was higher. I loved every minute of it. The work demanded precision, professionalism, discipline. Every detail mattered. Every maneuver mattered. Every decision mattered. There was no room for complacency. And strangely enough, that made me feel alive. Because for years I had quietly carried other people's expectations. Now I was focused entirely on my own. Back home, however, very little changed, at least not from my family's perspective. Whenever I visited Texas, I seemed to step back into the same role. The overlooked daughter, the younger sister, the safe target. One summer afternoon, my parents hosted a family barbecue, the kind of gathering common across America. Paper plates, lawn chairs, children running through sprinklers, country music playing softly in the background. Everybody relaxed, everybody comfortable, at least until Jake arrived. By then he was 37, still charismatic, still funny, still capable of making an entire group laugh. The difference was that the laughter felt different now, less joyful, more defensive. Success had never fully replaced the dream he'd lost, and I think part of him knew it. I was helping Dad near the grill when Jake walked over. Emily. Jake. He glanced at my sunglasses, then at my Air Force shirt. A familiar smirk appeared. I knew what was coming. Some things never change. So how's the military? It's good. You still doing that? I laughed softly. Last time I checked, several relatives nearby chuckled. Jake shook his head dramatically. I figured you'd be tired of playing soldier by now. The conversation around us grew quieter. People sensed tension. They always did. Nobody intervened. They rarely did. I looked at him. I like what I do. He shrugged. Good for you. Then he took a sip of his drink. And here I thought you'd eventually get a real job. Several people laughed awkwardly. The kind of laughter people use when they don't know what else to do. I noticed my mother looking down, my father focusing on the grill. Neither said anything. Again, the moment should have hurt. Years earlier it would have. Instead I found myself feeling something unexpected. Pity. Not for myself. For Jake. Because I suddenly realized he was still fighting a battle that had ended years ago. The dream was gone. The disappointment was real. But he refused to leave that chapter behind. And it was costing him. That evening, after most of the guests had gone home, I sat alone on my parents' back porch. The Texas sky stretched endlessly overhead. Crickets filled the darkness. The air smelled like cut grass and barbecue smoke. Dad eventually joined me. For several minutes we sat quietly. Then he sighed. Your brother gives you a hard time. I smiled. A little. He stared toward the yard. You know he doesn't mean all of it. There it was. The familiar defense. The explanation. The excuse. I had heard versions of it for years. Normally I let it pass. This time I didn't. Dad. Yeah. When was the last time somebody asked him to stop? The question lingered. Neither of us spoke. Finally he looked away. And that answer told me everything. A few weeks later, a major television network announced coverage of an upcoming national air show. The event would attract enormous attention. Millions of viewers. National exposure. The kind of aviation spectacle people planned weekends around. I knew immediately that my family would watch. Jake never missed an air show. Never. Even after all these years. Especially not one this big. The irony wasn't lost on me. The little girl who had followed her brother through aviation museums and air shows was now preparing to fly in one, not as a spectator, not as a fan, as part of the show itself. Yet nobody back home knew. Not Jake. Not Mom. Not Dad. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't interested in telling them. Because some truths don't need announcements. Sometimes life reveals them on its own. And when it does, the lesson tends to be unforgettable. The morning of the air show began long before sunrise. Most people only see the performance.
The aircraft.
The smoke trails. The precision formations. The applause. They don't see the preparation. The briefings. The inspections. The hours of planning. The responsibility. And they certainly don't see the quiet moments when a pilot sits alone and realizes thousands, sometimes millions of people are about to watch. I remember standing beside the aircraft while the sky was still dark. The air was cool. The flight line lights reflected against polished metal. Ground crews moved efficiently around us. Everything felt calm, professional, routine. Yet beneath that routine was excitement. Not nervous excitement, gratitude. Because I knew exactly how many people would have traded places with me, including my brother. A few hundred miles away, my family was starting their day too. Though I wouldn't learn the details until later. According to my mother, Jake arrived early, earlier than anyone expected. He carried coffee and donuts, the way he used to whenever a big air show was on television. Apparently he was excited, like a kid again. That part made me smile when I heard it later. Because despite everything, Jake had never stopped loving aviation. Not really. He had simply stopped believing it could be part of his own future. Those are very different things. Back at the airfield, pilots gathered for the final briefing. Weather, safety procedures, flight schedules, communication plans, the usual details. Everyone focused. Everyone professional. Nobody treated the day casually. The crowd expected perfection. And perfection requires preparation. As the briefing concluded, one of the senior officers looked around the room, then smiled. "Let's give them a show they'll remember." The room responded with quiet confidence. Not arrogance. Professional pride. There is a difference. Meanwhile, my parents had settled into the living room. My father occupied his favorite recliner. My mother sat on the couch. Jake claimed the seat closest to the television. Some things never change. The network coverage began around noon. Commentators discussed aircraft, pilots, history, upcoming demonstrations. Jake reportedly corrected the announcers several times, at least according to my mother. That sounded exactly like him. For all his flaws, he knew aviation. Always had. He pointed out aircraft models, explained maneuvers, shared facts nobody else knew. For a little while, the old Jake returned. The enthusiastic boy from those childhood air shows. The brother I used to admire. The brother I missed. By early afternoon, I was climbing into the cockpit. That moment never gets old. The smell, the equipment, the routine. Every pilot develops habits, personal rituals, small actions that signal it's time to focus. I followed mine carefully. Checklists, communications, systems, everything exactly as trained. Everything exactly as practiced. Then I looked out across the airfield. Thousands of spectators filled the viewing areas. Families, veterans, children, aviation enthusiasts, people from all over America. Some wore military hats decorated with unit patches. Others carried folding chairs and cameras. Many had been attending air shows for decades. I felt honored to be there. Truly. Because opportunities like this don't belong to one person. They're built on years of support from instructors, mentors, crews, and teammates. Nobody reaches that stage alone. The demonstration began. Aircraft launched. Formations assembled. The performance unfolded exactly as planned. From the cockpit, the world looked different. Cleaner. Simpler. Focused. There is a unique clarity that comes during flight. The noise disappears. The distractions disappear. Only the mission remains. For a while, family never entered my mind. Neither did Jake. I was too busy flying. Too busy doing the job? Back in Texas, the television broadcast continued. The commentators introduced various segments. Different aircraft. Different pilots. Different demonstrations. My family watched casually. Interested. Entertained. Completely unaware of what was coming. Then the production team switched to a featured segment. A closer look at one of the demonstration pilots. The camera followed a pilot walking toward an aircraft. Helmet under one arm. Flight gear perfectly fitted. Professional. Confident. The announcer began speaking. And everything changed. According to my father, Jake stopped moving first. Not speaking. Not breathing. Moving. The announcer continued. Leading today's demonstration is Major Emily Parker. My name. Clear as day. Impossible to misunderstand. My mother later told me she thought she'd heard it wrong. She looked at the screen. Then looked again. Then sat frozen. The camera zoomed closer. Close enough to remove all doubt. There I was. Not someone who looked like me. Not someone with the same name. Me. The daughter. The sister. The family failure. Elio. The room went completely silent. Nobody knew what to say. For years they had imagined my military career as something small, ordinary, temporary. Background noise. Now reality was sitting in their living room. Broadcast nationwide. Impossible to ignore. The silence lasted several seconds. Maybe longer. Nobody remembers exactly. Shock has a strange effect on time. The aircraft accelerated. The demonstration continued. And for the next several minutes my family watched without speaking. Every maneuver. Every formation. Every pass across the sky. Jake never looked away. Neither did my parents. Years of assumptions were collapsing in real time. The daughter they overlooked. The sister they underestimated. The dream they thought belonged only to Jake. All of it unfolding before them. Not through an argument. Not through revenge. Not through confrontation. Through truth. When the broadcast ended, nobody rushed to speak. Nobody joked. Nobody changed the subject. The room remained quiet. My father eventually stood. Walked into the kitchen. Then came back. Still speechless. My mother wiped tears from her eyes. Jake remained seated, staring at the blank television screen. The same screen that had just revealed everything. The next morning, while I was reviewing post-event schedules at my temporary quarters, somebody knocked on the door. A firm knock. Unexpected. I opened it, and found my brother standing there. He looked exhausted. Like a man who hadn't slept. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Jake took a deep breath, and said the last thing I ever expected to hear from him. We need to talk. For most of my life, I imagined what I would say if Jake ever admitted he was wrong. I pictured arguments. Long speeches. Years of frustration finally pouring out. I imagined telling him exactly how much he'd hurt me. Exactly how many family dinners I'd endured. Exactly how many times I'd sat quietly while everyone acted as if my life didn't matter. But when I opened that door and saw him standing there, none of those speeches seemed important anymore. Because Jake didn't look like a man ready to argue. He looked like a man carrying something heavy. Something he'd been carrying for years. Can I come in? He asked. I stepped aside. Sure. The room was quiet. Small. Temporary. Military housing isn't glamorous. Never has been. Jake looked around. His eyes settled on framed photographs sitting on a shelf. Flight school. Graduation ceremonies. Squadron pictures.
Awards.
Years of memories. Years of work. Evidence of a life he had never bothered to ask about. For several moments he simply stared. Then he shook his head. I didn't know. No, I said gently. You didn't. We sat across from each other at a small kitchen table, the same way we'd sat across from each other at hundreds of family meals. Yet this felt entirely different. For once nobody else was there. No parents. No relatives. No audience. Just us. Jake folded his hands together, then unfolded them, then folded them again. A nervous habit I'd almost forgotten he had. Finally he spoke. When did all this happen? I smiled. What part? He gestured toward the photographs. The career. The flying. The air show. I laughed softly. Over the last 12 years, the answer wasn't meant to be sarcastic. But it landed that way anyway. Because the truth was obvious. My life hadn't been a secret. He simply hadn't been paying attention. Jake stared down at the table. I feel stupid. I considered that. Then shook my head. No. His eyes lifted. No. I think you're finally being honest. That answer seemed to surprise him. For several seconds he sat quietly. Then he nodded. Fair enough. The conversation moved slowly after that, like two people trying to cross a damaged bridge. Carefully. One step at a time. Eventually Jake leaned back in his chair. I hated watching that air show. The statement caught me off guard. Hated it. He nodded. I was proud of you. Then he looked away. And I hated it. Now I understood. Not because I shared his feelings. Because I finally understood their source. Why, I asked. Jake laughed bitterly. Because that was supposed to be me. There it was. The truth. Not jealousy. Not really. Grief. Old grief. Unresolved grief. The kind people carry so long they forget they're carrying it. For the next hour, Jake talked more honestly than I had ever heard him talk before. He told me about the medical disqualification, the embarrassment, the humiliation, the feeling of watching his future disappear. I already knew most of the facts. What I didn't know were the emotions behind them. The fear, the shame, the anger, the loneliness. For years, everyone had focused on the dream he lost. Very few people had focused on the person who lost it, including Jake himself. I kept thinking I'd find something else, he admitted. Something that felt the same. Did you? He shook his head. No, the answer came immediately. Too immediately. The kind of answer somebody has lived with for years. I got jobs. He shrugged. I made money. I paid bills. But none of it ever felt like flying. I nodded, understanding more than he realized. Because every person reaches a point where they discover the difference between making a living and feeling alive. Jake never found the second part. Then his eyes met mine. And then there was you. I stayed quiet. You kept going. Another pause. You lived the dream. The words sounded painful, but also freeing. Like finally admitting something he'd spent years avoiding. I nodded slowly. Yes. For the first time in my life, I didn't minimize it. Didn't soften it. Didn't apologize for it. I had earned it. And both of us knew it. Jake rubbed his face. I think I started blaming you. The honesty startled me, even though I'd suspected it for years. You? He nodded. It didn't make sense. I knew that. But every time you succeeded, his voice trailed off. I finished the sentence for him. It reminded you. He nodded. Exactly. Every achievement, every promotion, every step forward had reminded him of the path he'd lost. And because he couldn't fight the loss, he fought the reminder. Me. The strange thing was that hearing the truth didn't make me angry. It made me sad. Because I suddenly saw how much energy he'd wasted. Years of resentment. Years of comparison. Years spent staring backward instead of forward. And for what? Nothing. Not 1 minute of it had changed the past. A few days later, our parents joined us for dinner. The atmosphere was awkward at first. Nobody quite knew how to begin. Then my mother surprised everyone, including herself. She started crying. Not dramatically, quietly. The kind of crying that comes from realization. We failed you, she said. I blinked. What? She looked directly at me. We failed you. The room went silent. Dad stared at the table. Jake looked down. Mom continued. We were so worried about your brother. Her voice trembled. We forgot you needed us too. I didn't know what to say. Because I'd imagined apologies before. Many times. But reality felt different. Messier. More human. Less satisfying. And somehow more meaningful. Dad finally spoke. We thought we were helping him. You were, I said. He nodded. Maybe. Then he sighed. But we stopped seeing what it was costing you. Nobody argued. Because everybody knew it was true. Eventually the conversation softened. The tension eased. The honesty remained. For the first time in years, we weren't pretending. And that mattered. More than revenge. More than being right. More than winning. Before leaving that evening, Jake walked me to my car. The sun was beginning to set. The sky glowed orange over the Texas horizon. He stood quietly for a moment, then asked a question. A simple question, but one that carried the weight of years. Why didn't you ever tell us? I looked at him, and for the first time I knew exactly how to answer. For years I thought I knew exactly how I would answer that question. Why didn't you ever tell us? I imagined saying something dramatic, something sharp, something that would finally make everyone understand. But standing there beside my car looking at my brother, I realized the answer was much simpler than that. I did tell you. Jake frowned. What? I told you every time somebody asked. The confusion remained. So I smiled. I joined the Air Force. He nodded. I know. I told you when I graduated training. Another nod. I told you when I got promoted. Yeah, I told you when I changed assignments. His expression slowly shifted. The pieces were finally connecting. I wasn't talking about secrets. I was talking about attention. For years, the information had been available. Nobody had listened. Not really. Not completely. Not with genuine curiosity. Jake stared toward the fading horizon, then laughed quietly. A sad laugh. The kind people make when they finally recognize a truth they'd spent years avoiding. We never asked. No, we didn't. And somehow those 3 words carried more honesty than anything he'd said before. Oh, on the flight home the next day I spent a lot of time looking out the window. Clouds stretched endlessly beneath the aircraft. The world seemed peaceful from 30,000 feet. Smaller somehow, less complicated. Distance has a way of doing that. Problems that feel enormous on the ground often look different from above. Not insignificant, just easier to understand. For years I had carried resentment toward my family. Not overwhelming resentment, not hatred, just a quiet ache. The ache of feeling unseen. The ache of watching someone else's pain matter more than your own. The ache of realizing that being the dependable child often means receiving less attention than the struggling one. Many people my age understand that feeling, especially those who grew up in families where one person's crisis became everybody else's priority. Looking down at those clouds, I finally understood something. My parents hadn't loved me less. They had simply worried about Jake more. Those aren't the same thing, and while that realization didn't erase the hurt, it helped me understand it. Understanding changes things. Over the next several months, something unusual happened. My family started paying attention. Not in a dramatic way. Not overnight. Slowly. Naturally. Mom called more often. Not to discuss Jake, to ask about me. The first time it happened, I almost laughed. She called one evening while I was making dinner. After a few minutes of conversation, she asked, "So what are you working on these days?" I actually paused because I couldn't remember the last time she'd asked. Not politely, not out of obligation, with genuine interest. We spent nearly 40 minutes talking about aviation, travel, career goals, life. When we hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, smiling. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives through small questions that should have been asked years ago. Dad changed too, though in his own way. One afternoon he mailed me a newspaper clipping, a local article about aviation. Nothing particularly special, except for the handwritten note attached. Saw this and thought of you. Love, Dad. That was it. 12 words, yet I probably read them 20 times. Because after years of feeling overlooked, even small signs of recognition carry enormous weight. So, the biggest change, however, came from Jake. Not immediately. Growth rarely happens immediately. But it happened. Gradually. Steadily. One choice at a time. For the first time in years, he stopped comparing our lives. Stopped measuring his losses against my successes. Stopped treating every accomplishment of mine as evidence of his failure. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was something better. It was real. One evening he called me unexpectedly. I signed up for flight lessons. I nearly dropped my phone. What? He laughed. You heard me. I sat down, honestly stunned. At 37 years old, Jake wasn't trying to become a fighter pilot. That chapter was over. He knew it. I knew it. But for the first time in nearly 2 decades, he was reconnecting with the thing he loved instead of mourning the thing he lost. That mattered. A lot. How was it? I asked. There was a pause. Then I heard something I hadn't heard from him in years. Pure excitement. It was incredible. And just like that, I heard the boy from those childhood air shows again. The boy who stared at airplanes with wonder. The boy who dreamed without bitterness. The boy I'd missed. The following summer, another major air show came to Texas. This time my family attended in person. Not because I asked. Because they wanted to. Mom brought sunscreen. Dad brought binoculars. Jake showed up wearing an aviation cap that looked older than some of the spectators. The sight made me laugh. Before the event began, we stood together near the flight line. The sun was bright. The crowd was enormous. Children pointed toward aircraft. Veterans shared stories. Families spread blankets across the grass. America has a special relationship with air shows. They're part celebration, part history lesson, part family tradition. Standing there with my parents and my brother felt strangely emotional, not because I was flying, because for the first time in years we were sharing the experience together. No resentment, no competition, no old arguments, just family. Later that afternoon, after the demonstration ended, we sat together watching the crowd disperse. Jake nudged my shoulder, a familiar gesture from childhood. I was wrong about you. I smiled. You were wrong about a lot of things. He laughed. Fair enough. Then his expression softened. I'm proud of you, Em. The words were simple, ordinary. Yet somehow they meant more than any television broadcast ever could. Because this wasn't about being seen by millions of strangers. It was about being seen by the people who mattered. As I look back now, I realize something important. The greatest victory wasn't appearing on television. It wasn't earning wings. It wasn't proving anybody wrong. The greatest victory was learning that my worth never depended on their approval. Not my brother's, not my parents', not anyone's. Once I understood that, everything changed. Success became lighter. Relationships became healthier. Life became richer. And maybe that's the lesson hidden inside this story. Sometimes the people closest to us don't see us clearly. Sometimes they underestimate us. Sometimes they carry wounds that prevent them from recognizing our strengths. But we don't have to wait for recognition before moving forward. We don't have to wait for applause before becoming who we're meant to be. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, or perhaps a chapter of your own journey, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on it. And if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly working towards something meaningful, remember this. Keep going. The people around you may not see your progress right away, but that doesn't make it any less real. And if you enjoyed spending this time with me, I'd be honored if you'd share your thoughts, share this story with someone who might need it, and join me again for another journey. The old man looked at me like he belonged there. Not startled, not confused, not dangerous exactly. Just waiting. The basement light was dead along with the rest of the house, and rain hammered the windows upstairs hard enough to shake the old beams. I stood frozen halfway down the stairs, clutching a flashlight in one hand, while muddy water dripped from the hem of my jeans. The old man sat in a wooden chair beside the breaker box, like he'd been sitting there for years. "You took your time getting back," he said. My son Tyler screamed behind me again. "Grandma, who is that?" I wish I could tell you I handled the moment calmly. At 62 years old, I'd survived raising 2 kids, burying my mother, caring for my father through cancer, and sitting through a divorce hearing that stripped away nearly every decent thing I had left. But standing in that basement, I was terrified. "Who the hell are you?" I asked. The old man slowly stood. He had to be close to 80, tall, thin, wearing an old green army jacket with a Detroit Tigers cap pulled low over white hair. He looked tired more than threatening. "My name's Elias Bennett," he said quietly. "And your father knew you'd come here someday." That stopped me cold. Nobody had mentioned my father in years, not after what happened. Not after he disappeared from town. A loud crack of thunder shook the house overhead. Tyler grabbed my arm. My daughter Megan stood at the top of the stairs holding her phone flashlight toward us, her face pale. "Mom," she whispered, "should I call somebody?" The old man shook his head slowly. "You can," he said, "but by the time the sheriff gets out here in this storm, I'll be gone." Then he looked directly at me. "But before I leave, you need to hear something about this house." That was 3 months after my divorce became final. 3 months after Gary walked away with almost everything we spent 40 years building together. People think losing a marriage hurts most because of heartbreak. At our age, it's not heartbreak that kills you. It's humiliation. Gary got the house in Columbus, the lake cabin in Florida, most of the retirement account, even our dog Murphy. You'd think a judge wouldn't separate a woman from a 12-year-old golden retriever she raised from a puppy, but apparently life keeps finding ways to surprise you. Gary had a younger lawyer, expensive suits, perfect hair, calm voice. I had a public defender and swollen eyes from crying in grocery store parking lots. By the end of the hearing, I felt less like a human being and more like leftover furniture nobody wanted. Megan tried helping me hold together what dignity I had left. "Mom," she told me one night while packing boxes, "you still have us." She meant well, but she was hurting too. At 38, she was going through her own divorce. She and Tyler had moved into a small apartment after her husband left for Arizona with another woman he met online. 3 generations of bad luck sitting around folding laundry together. That's how we ended up driving north to Michigan in my father's old Buick with everything we owned stuffed into the trunk. The lake house had belonged to my dad for decades. Nobody in the family wanted it after he died. Honestly, nobody even talked about it much. As kids, Megan and my son David spent summers there fishing off the dock and roasting hot dogs over a fire pit. Back then, the place felt magical. Now it looked like something forgotten by time. The mailbox leaned sideways. Half the shutters hung crooked. The porch steps sagged under our feet when we carried in boxes. Tyler looked around and muttered, "This place looks haunted." "Don't start," Megan told him. But secretly I agreed with him. Inside smelled like mildew-old wood and closed-up winters. Still, it was ours. Or at least the bank hadn't taken it yet. That first evening we unpacked canned food, blankets, and a coffee maker. Rain started around sunset. By 9 o'clock the storm had turned violent. Wind screamed through the trees surrounding the lake. The power died with a loud pop. Tyler groaned, perfect. Megan lit candles while I searched kitchen drawers for a flashlight. I remember thinking how strange silence feels after electricity disappears. No refrigerator hum, no television noise, just rain and darkness. Then came the knocking. 3 slow knocks at the front door. Everyone froze. Tyler whispered, "Did you hear that?" Of course we heard it. Another 3 knocks echoed through the house. I opened the door expecting maybe a neighbor. Nobody stood there. Only rain. But lying on the porch was a white envelope with my name written across the front. Linda Carter. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Cash offer for property. No signature, no phone number. Just a dollar amount large enough to make my knees weak. Megan stared at it. "Mom, who would offer this kind of money for this dump?" I didn't answer. Because deep down something about it scared me. An hour later, the power still hadn't returned, so I grabbed the flashlight and headed for the basement breaker. And that's when I found Elias waiting in the dark. He glanced at the envelope still clutched in my hand. "They started faster than I expected," he murmured. "What are you talking about?" I snapped. Elias walked slowly toward the stairs. "Your father spent 30 years making sure certain people never got what they wanted." He looked around the basement carefully. "Now they think you're weak enough to sell. I don't even know who you are." "No," he said softly, "but Walter trusted me." Nobody had called my father Walter around me in decades. To me he was simply Dad. The man who vanished from our lives little by little after my mother died. The man people in town whispered about. The man Gary once called that crazy old hermit. Elias pointed toward the far basement wall. "Before your father died, he said he told me someday you'd come back here after losing everything." A chill crept through me that had nothing to do with the storm. He said when that day came you'd finally understand why he stayed. I stared at him. Outside, thunder rolled over the lake. Then Elias said the words that changed my life forever. "Your father didn't leave you this house," he said quietly. "He left you the truth." Rain hammered the roof hard enough to keep any of us from sleeping after Elias left. I stood by the living room window most of the night watching the dark shoreline disappear behind sheets of rain while Megan and Tyler slept under borrowed blankets beside the fireplace. Every few minutes I replayed the old man's words in my head. "Your father didn't leave you this house. He left you the truth." At my age you learn to distrust dramatic statements. Usually when somebody says something mysterious it turns out to be nonsense or salesmanship. Still something about Elias felt real. Not because he frightened me. Because he looked sad. People who lie for profit usually carry a certain energy. Confidence. Sharpness. They want something from you. Elias looked like a man carrying something heavy for too long. Around 3 in the morning, the storm finally weakened enough for me to doze off in Dad's old recliner. I woke to the smell of coffee. Megan stood in the kitchen wearing one of my father's flannel shirts over sweatpants. "Well," she said, forcing a smile, "the stove still works." Morning light revealed just how rough the lake house really was. Water stains covered the ceiling. One kitchen cabinet hung crooked from rusted hinges. The wallpaper peeled near the windows, and the hardwood floors tilted slightly toward the lake side of the house. Tyler shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. "So," he said carefully, "are we gonna talk about basement, Grandpa?" I almost laughed despite myself. "Not before coffee," I said. But the truth was I didn't know what to say. Because once daylight arrived, the whole thing sounded impossible. An old man waiting in a basement during a storm. It sounded like the beginning of one of those ridiculous late-night cable mysteries. Still, the envelope remained on the kitchen table. Real. So was the fear I felt when Elias mentioned my father. After breakfast, I drove into town hoping normal errands might settle my nerves. The town of Blackwater looked smaller than I remembered. Most lake towns up north do after enough years pass. The hardware store still stood on Main Street beside the diner where my mother used to order grilled cheese sandwiches during summer fishing trips. Only now half the storefront sat empty. I stopped at Miller's Hardware for batteries and cleaning supplies. The young cashier couldn't have been older than 25, but the older man stocking shelves behind him stared at me for a long moment. Then his expression changed. "You're Walter Carter's daughter," he said. Not a question. I nodded cautiously. "Haven't seen one of your family around here in years." His tone wasn't unfriendly exactly. "Just careful. My dad passed away 8 years ago," I said. The old man slowly leaned against the shelf. "Walter was a good man." Something in the way he said it caught my attention. Not everybody used to say that. Growing up, my father had always felt like 2 different people depending on who you asked. To me, he was quiet, patient, the kind of dad who fixed broken bicycles and made pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse when Megan and David visited. But in town, people whispered, After Mom died, Dad became more isolated every year. He stopped attending church, stopped coming to town events. Some people claimed he drank too much, others said he'd gotten paranoid. Gary used to hate visiting him. He acts like somebody's after him, Gary once complained during a Thanksgiving trip years earlier. At the time I thought Dad was simply lonely. Now I wasn't so sure. When I carried my supplies outside, I noticed a black pickup truck parked across the street. The driver sat behind tinted windows, watching me. The moment I looked directly at the truck, it pulled away. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. Back at the lake house, I found Tyler wandering around the basement with a flashlight. You shouldn't be down here alone, I told him. Relax, Grandma. He pointed toward the breaker box. I was trying to figure out how that old guy even got in. Truthfully, I'd wondered the same thing. The basement had only one small window and the stair entrance from the kitchen. No sign of forced entry. No footprints. Nothing. Tyler shined the flashlight across the far wall. You notice this? At first I didn't understand what he meant. Then I saw it. One section of the basement floor near the back wall looked slightly different from the rest. The concrete color changed subtly there, like part of it had been repaired years earlier. Tyler crouched beside it. You think there's something under there? Probably old pipes, I said automatically. But my stomach tightened. Because my father had worked construction most of his life. And suddenly I remembered something. When I was maybe 12 years old, I came downstairs one summer while Dad was working in the basement late at night. He nearly jumped out of his skin when he saw me. I'd never forgotten the fear on his face. Linda, he snapped louder than usual, don't come down here without telling me first. At the time I cried because I thought he was angry. Now I wondered what he'd been hiding. That afternoon, Megan and I started cleaning old furniture while Tyler explored the property outside. Around 4 o'clock, another vehicle pulled into the gravel driveway. This time it was a silver Lexus. A man stepped out wearing an expensive navy coat and polished shoes completely unsuited for mud. He smiled before I even reached the porch. Mrs. Carter, he said warmly. Richard Holloway. The name meant nothing to me. I apologize for arriving unannounced, he continued smoothly. I represent a development group interested in several lakefront properties. Of course. The envelope. You're offering to buy this place. Richard glanced toward the lake with a practiced smile. This property has tremendous potential. You mean expensive potential? He chuckled softly like we shared a joke. I understand you've recently gone through difficult circumstances. His eyes drifted toward the aging house. I'd hate for you to feel trapped maintaining a property this size. There it was. Not concern. Pressure. I crossed my arms. My father owned this house for 40 years. Funny nobody cared until now. Something flickered behind Richard's smile, then disappeared. Your father was an interesting man. The same careful tone from the hardware store. Before I could respond, another truck pulled into the driveway. Old rusted loud muffler. Elias climbed out slowly. The moment Richard Holloway saw him, his entire expression hardened. For one brief second, the politeness vanished completely. Elias walked up beside me without looking at Richard. Don't sell the house, he said quietly. Richard forced another smile. I'm simply making a generous business offer. No, Elias replied calmly. You're trying to bury something. Silence settled over the yard. Wind stirred across the lake behind us. Then Richard looked directly at me. Mrs. Carter, he said softly. You should ask yourself why an old man would risk dragging your family into things that ended decades ago. Elias finally turned toward him. Because some graves don't stay buried forever. Richard stared at him for several seconds. Then he got back into his Lexus and drove away without another word. I looked at Elias. What the hell is going on? He removed his cap slowly. And for the first time I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Your father kept records, he said. Records powerful people would kill to find. I didn't sleep much after Elias told me about the records. At 62 years old, sleep doesn't come easy even under normal circumstances. At a collapsing marriage, a decaying lake house, and the possibility that wealthy strangers are circling your property for hidden evidence, and your mind starts running like an old washing machine that won't shut off. The next morning I woke before sunrise and found Elias sitting on the porch with a thermos of coffee balanced beside him. The lake was perfectly still. No storm, no wind. Just gray water stretching beneath a pale Michigan sky. You always sneak onto people's property before breakfast, I asked. Elias smiled faintly. Your father used to say mornings were the only honest part of the day. I sat beside him without answering. For a while, we just listened to birds moving through the pine trees. Finally, I said, start talking. Elias nodded slowly like he'd expected that. In the 70s, he began this town changed fast. Money came in. Developers bought shoreline property cheap. New marinas, resorts, vacation homes. He stared toward the water. Most folks thought it was progress. And my father, he worked construction for Holloway's father back then. That surprised me. Dad rarely talked about work, except ordinary stories about roofing jobs or concrete pouring. He discovered something by accident, Elias continued. Chemical dumping. I frowned. What kind of dumping? Industrial waste. Drums buried near the north side of the lake. Elias rubbed his hands together slowly. A few years later, people started getting sick. The calmness in his voice somehow made the story worse. I remembered rumors from childhood. Neighbors with strange illnesses. One family that moved away suddenly after their youngest daughter got leukemia. At the time, adults never explained much around children. They covered it up, I asked. Elias looked at me carefully. Your father tried stopping them. The old porch boards creaked beneath us. I shook my head slowly. That doesn't make sense. My father barely talked to anybody by the time I was grown. Because they destroyed him first. That sentence hit harder than I expected. For years I carried quiet resentment toward my father. Not hatred exactly, but disappointment. After Mom died, he disappeared emotionally long before he disappeared physically. Birthdays forgotten, calls unanswered. Entire summers without visits. Gary used to say your dad likes misery too much. Part of me believed him. Now I wondered how wrong we'd all been. Elias reached into his coat pocket and handed me an old photograph. 5 men stood beside a construction truck sometime in the late 70s. One of them was my father. Younger, stronger, smiling. I almost didn't recognize him. That's Richard Holloway's father beside Walter, Elias said quietly. The man standing next to Dad wore the same polished confidence I'd seen in Richard yesterday. Something cold settled in my stomach. What exactly did my father keep? Proof. Proof of what? That people in this town sold their souls for money. Before I could ask more, Tyler burst through the screen door holding a rusted metal box. Grandma, he said breathlessly, I found this under the stairs. Elias stood so fast his coffee nearly spilled. Where? In the basement. The box looked old, military green, rusted around the edges. My hands trembled slightly when I opened it. Inside sat dozens of papers wrapped carefully in yellowed plastic. Receipts, photographs, bank statements, and names. So many names. I pulled out one document showing a payment ledger from 1978. Several town officials appeared beside dollar amounts. Police chief, county inspector, even a doctor. At the bottom sat one name I recognized instantly. Frank Dawson. My Uncle Frank? Mom's younger brother. I stared at the page in disbelief. No, I whispered. Elias lowered his eyes. He testified against your father. I looked up sharply. For what? Walter accused Holloway's company publicly, claimed they poisoned the lake. Elias sighed deeply. But when hearings started, witnesses suddenly changed their stories, including my uncle. I sat there stunned while decades of family memories rearranged themselves inside my head. Uncle Frank always hated Dad. At holidays he'd mutter things like Walter's chasing ghosts again, or your father's gonna ruin himself with all this nonsense. I thought they simply disliked each other. Now I understood. Frank sold him out. Tyler picked up one of the photographs. What's this? The picture showed several rusted barrels half buried near muddy shoreline. Warning labels barely visible. Even I could tell the image was bad news. Megan appeared in the doorway behind us. What's going on? Nobody answered immediately. Because suddenly the quiet lake house didn't feel abandoned anymore. It felt watched. That evening I drove into town alone to confront Uncle Frank. He lived in a retirement community about 15 minutes south near Traverse City. Small apartment, Golf Channel always playing, recliner facing the television. When he opened the door and saw me, his smile disappeared immediately. Well, he muttered, didn't expect company. I walked inside holding the ledger in my purse. You lied about my father. Frank shut the door slowly. For a moment he looked very old. Elias Bennett found you, he said. Not a question. You took money. Frank lowered himself carefully into his recliner. You don't understand how things were back then. Then explain it. His jaw tightened. People needed jobs, Linda. Holloway kept this town alive. And poisoning people was acceptable. You think your father was some hero, Frank snapped suddenly. Walter scared everybody. He kept pushing and pushing. Because he was right. Frank looked away. That silence told me everything. After nearly a minute he spoke softly. You know what happens to men who fight people with money? They lose. I felt anger rise inside me, slow and hot. My father lost his family too. Frank flinched slightly at that. For the first time guilt crossed his face. You weren't there after your mother died, he murmured. Walter stopped trusting anybody. He thought everyone was watching him. Were they? Frank didn't answer. When I left his apartment, dusk had settled across town, and sitting across the street was the same black pickup truck from yesterday. Engine running. Waiting. This time when I drove away, the truck followed me, not aggressively, just far enough behind to make sure I noticed. By the time I reached the lake house, my hands shook on the steering wheel. I rushed inside and locked the door. Megan saw my face immediately. "Mom, what happened?" Before I could answer, Tyler yelled from the hallway. "There's somebody outside." We all turned toward the lake-facing window. A figure stood near the dock in the darkness, watching the house. Then slowly the person lifted something into the air. A gas can. A terrible realization hit me all at once. They weren't trying to scare us anymore. They were trying to erase everything my father left behind. The man by the dock stood perfectly still while rainwater dripped from the gas can hanging at his side. "Tyler," whispered Grandma. Megan grabbed his shoulder and pulled him back from the window. Every instinct inside me screamed to call the police. But another part of me already understood something ugly about small towns and powerful families. Sometimes the police arrive too late. Sometimes they arrive already knowing who they're supposed to protect. The figure near the dock slowly turned and disappeared into the darkness before I could reach the front porch. I stepped outside anyway. Cold wind swept across the lake hard enough to sting my face. The dock creaked softly in the dark, empty now except for puddles reflecting moonlight through broken clouds. No footprints. No vehicle headlights. Nothing. Still the smell of gasoline lingered faintly in the air. That was enough. Inside, Megan crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "We need to leave." "Nobody's leaving," Tyler said immediately. "Tyler." "No," he snapped. "Mom, somebody tried to scare us off. That means Grandma's father was telling the truth." I looked at him in surprise. 3 months earlier, Tyler barely spoke to anyone unless forced. After his parents' divorce, he spent most days hidden behind headphones and video games, carrying anger around like extra weight on his shoulders. Now I saw something different in him. Purpose. Megan looked exhausted. "I'm serious, Mom. This is insane. We can't fight rich people in some mystery movie." "She's right," I admitted quietly. The room went silent. Then I looked toward the basement door. "But I also can't walk away without knowing what my father died protecting." That changed something inside me. For the first time since my divorce, I stopped feeling like a victim being pushed from one disaster into another. Fear remained. But underneath it, something older woke up. Stubbornness. The next morning, Elias returned, carrying a brown paper bag full of groceries. "Figured you folks could use real food," he said. Inside were eggs, bacon bread, and black coffee from the diner in town. Tyler grinned immediately. "Okay," he said, "I officially trust Basement Grandpa now." Elias actually laughed at that. It softened him somehow. Over breakfast, I told him about the man by the dock. His face darkened immediately. "They're getting nervous." "Who exactly is they?" Megan asked sharply. Elias sat quietly for a moment before answering. "Richard Holloway owns half this county now. Marina's construction company's Shoreline Developments." He looked at me, but his father started with almost nothing. "The dumping." Elias nodded. "When Walter discovered it, Holloway's father thought he could buy him off like everybody else." He paused. "Problem was your father couldn't be bought." I stared down at my coffee. Nobody had described my father that way before. Not honorable, not brave, usually just difficult. "You said my father kept records," I said. "Why not turn them over years ago?" He tried. And Elias gave me a tired smile. "Money wins a lot in America, Linda, especially in the 70s. That truth landed hard because it still felt true now. After breakfast, Tyler insisted on searching the basement again. This time Elias joined him while Megan and I cleaned upstairs. Around noon I heard Tyler yell, "Grandma, get down here." I nearly slipped running to the basement. Tyler stood beside the staircase, pointing toward the wall underneath it. "There," he said breathlessly. At first I saw nothing unusual. Then Elias pressed against a wooden panel hidden beneath decades of dust. It moved inward slightly. A hidden door. My pulse started hammering. Together, Elias and Tyler pulled the panel open, revealing a narrow crawl space behind the stairs. The air inside smelled stale and damp. Elias aimed a flashlight into the darkness. "Oh my God," Megan whispered behind me. Shelves lined the hidden room wall to wall. Boxes. File folders. Tape recordings, newspaper clippings. Decades of secrets. I stepped inside, slowly brushing cobwebs from my coat sleeve. Everything had been organized carefully, methodically, like my father spent years preparing for this moment. Tyler opened one box filled with cassette tapes labeled by date. Megan uncovered folders containing medical reports and environmental studies. Then I found the letters. Dozens of them. Some addressed to lawyers, others to state agencies, newspaper editors, even senators. Most were never mailed. At the bottom of one box sat an old cassette recorder. Elias picked it up carefully. Walter made recordings, he said quietly. I pressed play before anybody could stop me. Static crackled through the tiny speaker. Then my father's voice filled the room. Older, tired, but unmistakably his. If something happens to me, he said, people need to know Holloway paid them all. Megan covered her mouth. I couldn't breathe. Hearing a dead parent's voice does something strange to the human heart. For a moment, time folds in on itself. You become a child again instantly. Dad continued speaking on the tape. Frank took money, Sheriff Dunleavy too. Dr. Mercer signed false reports. Papers rustled somewhere near the recorder. They buried everything. Then came a long silence. Finally, Dad spoke again, softer this time. Linda deserved better than the life this caused. Tears hit my cheeks before I realized I was crying, because suddenly I understood something that shattered me completely. My father hadn't abandoned us emotionally after Mom died. He'd been terrified enough to spend years hiding evidence inside his own home. Megan wrapped her arms around me while the tape hissed softly in the silence. Then Tyler said, somebody's outside. We all froze. A vehicle engine rumbled from the driveway above us. Elias immediately killed the flashlight. The basement fell dark. Footsteps crossed the porch overhead. Slow, heavy. Then came the sound of someone trying the front door handle. Once. Twice. Tyler whispered, they know. Nobody moved. The doorknob rattled harder this time. Then suddenly stopped. A long silence followed. Finally, we heard the vehicle drive away. Only after several minutes did Elias speak. They're searching for the records now. I wiped my eyes quickly. How bad is this really? Elias looked directly at me. Bad enough that your father lost his entire life protecting this evidence. He hesitated. And bad enough that Holloway will destroy anyone standing in his way. That evening, after locking every door and window, I sat alone on the porch listening to waves hit the dock. For the first time in years, I thought about Gary. Not with sadness. Not even anger. Perspective changes strange things. A few months earlier, I believed my husband taking the house was the worst betrayal imaginable. Now I was learning betrayal had shaped my family long before Gary ever entered my life. Then headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. A familiar silver Lexus rolled slowly toward the house. Richard Holloway stepped out wearing the same calm smile as before. But this time he wasn't pretending to be friendly. You found something, he said. Richard Holloway stood in my driveway with his hands tucked calmly inside his coat pockets while lake wind moved through the pine trees behind him. You found something, he repeated. The porch light above me flickered weakly after the storm damage, throwing shadows across his face. I stayed near the front door. At my age, I said carefully, I've learned not to answer questions from strangers at night. Richard smiled faintly. Your father always said things like that too. Hearing him speak about my father made my skin crawl. What do you want? To help you avoid making a serious mistake. That almost made me laugh. 3 months earlier, I would have folded under pressure like this. Back then, I still believed politeness protected people. Divorce cured me of that illusion. Now I understood something important about wealthy men. The dangerous ones rarely shout. They speak softly while taking everything from you. Richard stepped closer to the porch. I know Elias showed you something, he said. And I know Walter left records behind. I crossed my arms tightly. And if he did... Richard's expression stayed calm, but his eyes hardened. Your father wasted his life chasing ghosts. No, I said quietly. I think other people wasted it for him. For the first time, Richard lost patience. Mrs. Carter, you have no idea how much damage those accusations caused. Then why are you so afraid of old papers? Silence settled between us. Wind rattled dead leaves across the driveway. Finally, Richard sighed. You think this ends with justice? He asked softly. It won't. It ends with lawyers, investigators, and your family dragged through years of ugliness. He looked toward the house windows where Tyler and Megan stood watching. Your grandson deserves better than that. There it was. Not a threat exactly. Something colder. A warning. I stared at him for several seconds. Then I said the one thing I never imagined myself saying at this stage of life. You should leave my property. Richard studied me carefully like he was recalculating something. Then he nodded once. When people lose everything, he said quietly, they often confuse anger with courage. After he drove away, I locked every door in the house. Tyler looked furious. I hate that guy. Get in line, Megan muttered. But Elias looked more worried than angry. He's desperate now, he said. Good, Tyler snapped. No, Elias replied sharply. Desperate men are dangerous. That night, nobody slept much. Around 2 in the morning, I heard Elias moving around downstairs. I found him sitting alone at the kitchen table drinking coffee in darkness except for the stove light. You okay? I asked. He nodded without conviction. I keep thinking about your father. I sat across from him quietly. He knew this day might come, Elias said. That's why he organized everything so carefully. I looked toward the basement door. All those years, I whispered. And nobody believed him. Elias rubbed tired eyes. Some did. That surprised me. Then why didn't anybody help? A bitter smile crossed his face. Fear pays better than honesty most days. I thought about that long after he went to bed. Fear had shaped almost every major moment of my life lately. Fear of losing my marriage. Fear of losing stability. Fear of aging alone. Fear of not mattering anymore. But somewhere between the divorce and this old lake house, something strange had happened. I stopped being afraid of losing things, because the worst had already happened. And somehow I survived it. The next morning I made a decision. We're not hiding anymore, I told Megan. She looked up from the kitchen sink. What does that mean? It means if Holloway wants silence, we do the opposite. 2 hours later, Elias drove me into Traverse City to meet an old newspaper editor named Helen Morris. Helen had to be close to 75 with silver hair, reading glasses hanging from a chain, and the sharpest eyes I'd ever seen. When Elias explained why we were there, she locked her office door immediately. Let me see the documents. For nearly 3 hours, Helen reviewed ledgers, photographs, and copies of environmental reports while saying almost nothing. Finally, she leaned back in her chair slowly. My God, she murmured. You believe it? I asked. Helen looked offended. I covered this story in 1979 before my editor killed it. She tapped one photograph angrily. People got sick here, Linda. A heavy silence filled the office. Then Helen looked directly at me. You understand what happens once this moves publicly? I nodded. I think so. No, she said softly. You really don't, but she agreed to help anyway. That afternoon marked the beginning of Richard Holloway's collapse. At first it happened quietly. Helen contacted 2 investigative reporters she trusted in Detroit. Copies of the records went to environmental attorneys. One former state investigator agreed to review the evidence unofficially. Nobody announced anything publicly yet. But rumors started spreading, and rumors travel fast in small towns. 3 days later, somebody slashed all 4 tires on Elias's truck. The day after that, Tyler found dead fish scattered across the dock. Then came Gary. I should have known he'd appear eventually. He arrived wearing an expensive wool coat and the same irritated expression he always used when inconvenienced. Jesus, Linda, he muttered while stepping inside the house. This place is falling apart. I stared at him for a moment. Funny how quickly love can become unfamiliar. 40 years together and suddenly he looked like a stranger renting my memories. What do you want, Gary? He sighed dramatically. I heard some crazy rumors in Columbus. His eyes shifted toward Elias sitting by the fireplace. You're mixed up in something ugly. I almost laughed. You mean uglier than leaving your wife broke at 62? Gary ignored that. There are investors involved here, important people. He lowered his voice. You need to sell this property before things get worse. There it is, Megan said from the kitchen doorway. Finally. Gary frowned. What's that supposed to mean? It means stop pretending you care about Mom. His jaw tightened immediately. For years, Megan avoided confronting him directly. Now she looked at him with open disgust. Gary turned back toward me. Linda, I'm serious. Holloway's offering good money. That stopped me cold. How do you know Richard Holloway? Gary hesitated half a second too long. And that was enough. Everything suddenly clicked together. The pressure. The sudden interest in the property. The timing. You're involved with him. Gary's face hardened. Business partners cross paths. Business partners, Megan repeated bitterly. I stared at the man I spent most of my adult life trusting. Then I realized something painful. Gary didn't come here because he felt guilty. He came because he was scared. The records threatened him too. You knew, I whispered? Gary looked away. Not denial. Not anger. Just shame. And somehow that felt worse. After a long silence, Elias finally spoke from across the room. Walter warned me this would happen. Gary frowned. What? Elias met his eyes steadily. He said someday the people closest to Linda would betray her before strangers ever did. Nobody spoke after that. Gary left 20 minutes later without saying goodbye. That evening, local news stations started calling the house. By morning, Richard Holloway's company stock had begun falling. And just before sunset, Tyler came running down from the road holding his phone. Grandma, he said breathlessly, you need to see this. On the screen was a photograph. Elias, lying unconscious beside his truck in a hospital parking lot. Covered in blood. I got to the hospital just after midnight. The emergency entrance smelled like disinfectant, burnt coffee, and exhaustion. Rainwater dripped from my coat onto the tile floor while Megan stayed behind at the lake house with Tyler. At our age, hospitals stop feeling temporary. They start feeling familiar. Too familiar. Elias lay in a small room on the second floor with bruises covering half his face and stitches above one eye. Machines beeped softly beside him while snow drifted past the dark windows outside. For one terrible second seeing him there reminded me of my father during his final months. Fragile, worn down, alone. Elias opened his eyes when I entered. "Took you long enough," he muttered weakly. I almost cried from relief. "What happened?" He tried sitting up and winced immediately. "Parking garage," he murmured. "2 men. Holloway." Elias didn't answer directly, but he didn't need to. I sat beside the bed quietly. "You should walk away while you still can," he said after a moment. "No, Linda. I spent 40 years letting men make decisions for me. My voice surprised even me. I'm done with that." Elias stared at me for several seconds. Then slowly he smiled. Walter would have liked hearing that. Those words hit me harder than they should have. Because all my life I believed my father saw me as weak. Too soft, too trusting, too emotional. Now I wondered if he simply hoped I'd someday become stronger than he was. Elias motioned toward the bedside drawer. "There's something inside for you." I opened it carefully. Inside sat an old folded map sealed in plastic. Fishing routes marked across Blackwater Lake. At first it looked ordinary. Then I noticed small symbols drawn in red ink near the northern shoreline. "What is this?" Elias lowered his voice. "The last evidence Walter hid." A chill moved through me. "You knew where it was this whole time?" "No." He coughed painfully. "Walter only told me enough to guide you if things got bad. And now, they're bad." I unfolded the map fully across my lap. One section contained coordinates circled twice beside a handwritten note in my father's unmistakable block lettering. "When the water is still." He hid something in the lake. Elias nodded weakly. "Walter never trusted the house completely. Said someday people would tear it apart looking for proof." He closed his eyes briefly, so he made sure the most important evidence stayed somewhere nobody would think to search. I looked back down at the map. The lake. All these years, secrets sitting beneath the same water where my children once learned to fish. "You need to go before sunrise," Elias whispered, "before Holloway realizes what Walter did." Back at the lake house, Megan looked horrified when I explained the map. "You are not going out onto that lake in December. We don't have a choice." "There's always a choice." Tyler stepped closer immediately. "I'm going with Grandma." "No," Megan snapped. "Yes." I watched them argue while something strange settled inside me. Family. Messy, loud, protective. For months after the divorce, I thought Gary destroying our marriage meant our family had collapsed completely. But standing there in that old kitchen, I realized something important. Families survive differently than marriages do. By 4:30 the next morning, Tyler and I pushed my father's old aluminum fishing boat into freezing black water beneath a sky still heavy with clouds. The motor sputtered twice before catching. "You okay?" Tyler asked. I smiled tightly. "Ask me when we're back on shore." Truthfully, I was terrified. The lake stretched around us dark and endless while icy wind cut through my gloves. Tyler held the flashlight over the map while I guided the boat toward the northern side. Everything felt silent except the motor and waves hitting aluminum. Finally, Tyler pointed ahead. There, a weathered red buoy floated near a rocky section of shoreline almost hidden by trees. My father's marker. We killed the motor and drifted closer. Tyler leaned over with a hooked pole while I held the flashlight steady. For several minutes we found nothing. Then the hook caught. "Something's down there." Together we pulled slowly until a rusted metal lockbox emerged dripping from black water. My hands shook opening it. Inside sat sealed documents wrapped carefully in waterproof plastic. Photographs. Signed statements. Original contracts. And one cassette tape labeled simply, "If they finally come for the truth." Tyler looked at me wide-eyed. "This is it, isn't it?" I nodded slowly. This was the thing my father sacrificed everything to protect. The thing powerful men spent decades trying to erase. By noon that day, federal investigators arrived in Blackwater. Helen Morris moved fast once she saw the lake evidence. Environmental agencies reopened the original contamination case within hours. Reporters flooded the town by evening. And Richard Holloway's empire began collapsing almost immediately. Former employees started talking. Retired officials panicked. Bank records surfaced. By the following week, state investigators seized documents from Holloway development offices across 3 counties. The story exploded nationally after the cassette recording of my father reached the press. Suddenly, Walter Carter wasn't the paranoid old hermit people mocked for decades. He was the whistleblower nobody listened to. One afternoon I watched television coverage showing Richard Holloway being escorted into a courthouse surrounded by cameras. For a moment I expected satisfaction, victory, maybe even joy. Instead I mostly felt tired. Because revenge turns out stranger than people imagine. You spend years dreaming about justice, but when it finally arrives it doesn't give back what was stolen. It doesn't return marriages, or lost time, or lonely nights wondering why your life fell apart. A week later, Gary came to the lake house alone. No expensive coat this time, no confidence either. He stood awkwardly on the porch while snow drifted across the lake behind him. "I heard they froze my accounts," he said quietly. I folded my arms, and Gary swallowed hard. I didn't know how deep Holloway was involved back then. "But you still worked with him." He looked down. "I thought selling the land would solve everything." That sentence told me all I needed to know about Gary. All his life he believed money solved pain, protected dignity, created worth. And now he stood broke emotionally in ways no court could repair. "I was cruel to you," he admitted softly. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then unexpectedly I stopped feeling angry. Not because Gary deserved forgiveness, because carrying hatred suddenly felt exhausting. "I loved you for most of my life," I said quietly. "That doesn't disappear just because you failed me." Tears filled his eyes immediately. At our age, people cry differently. Less dramatic, more tired. Gary nodded once before leaving. I never saw him again after that day. Spring arrived slowly in Blackwater. The town started cleaning the shoreline using settlement money from the investigation. Families who suffered illnesses decades earlier finally received public acknowledgement. And one evening near sunset, I sat beside Elias on the repaired dock while Tyler laughed nearby, skipping stones across the water. "You know," Elias murmured, "Walter used to sit right here saying this lake would outlive all our secrets." I smiled softly. He was right. Elias handed me one final envelope. Walter's handwriting covered the front. "For Linda." Inside was a short letter from my father. Not about evidence, not about revenge. About kindness. About surviving disappointment without becoming bitter. About how losing everything sometimes clears enough space to finally see what matters. I cried reading it. Not from grief anymore. From peace. So, if you're listening to my story tonight carrying betrayal of your own, maybe this is what I'd tell you. Sometimes, the people who break your heart also push you toward the life you were supposed to find all along. And sometimes, long after the storm passes, you discover you were never as alone as you feared. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who may need the reminder that it's never too late for truth healing or a second beginning. "Good morning, Admiral." The words landed in the middle of my wedding reception like a stone dropped into still water. Conversation stopped. Forks hovered mid-air. Chairs scraped as people turned. I remember the sound of fabric shifting, dozens of guests twisting in their seats at once, trying to understand who the man in the tailored navy suit was speaking to. He was standing straight, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on me. And then he saluted. For a moment no one moved, not even me. Across the room I saw Harold, my soon-to-be father-in-law, go pale. His confident smile collapsed, his jaw loosening as if someone had cut the strings holding it in place. But that moment didn't begin there. It began long before the wedding, long before Harold's words cut through me in front of everyone I had come to call family. It began with a choice I made years ago to live quietly. I've never been the kind of woman who needed attention. After I retired, I moved to a small coastal town in Virginia just outside Norfolk. It was the kind of place where mornings started with the sound of gulls and ended with neighbors waving from their porches. Nothing fancy, just steady, familiar, and honest. I liked it that way. My house was modest, white siding, a narrow front porch, and a garden I tended myself. I grew tomatoes in the summer-trimmed hedges in the fall, and kept a small American flag by the door, not out of habit but out of respect. Most people in town knew me simply as Evelyn. Not ma'am, not commander, not admiral. Just Evelyn. And that was exactly how I wanted it. I met Richard at a community fundraiser. It was one of those local events where everyone brings a dish and someone inevitably burns the casserole. I had made lemon bars. He had brought store-bought cookies and apologized for them before anyone even tasted one. He was kind in a way that felt rare these days. Not loud, not showy, just present. We talked for nearly an hour that night. About books, about the ocean, about how strange it felt to start over later in life. He told me he'd been widowed for 5 years. I told him I understood loss. Neither of us asked too many questions. That was the beginning. Richard never pressed me about my past. He knew I had worked in government, and that seemed to satisfy him. Maybe it was his generation he understood that some things didn't need to be said out loud. Or maybe he trusted me enough not to ask. Either way, I was grateful. Because the truth was, I didn't want to be known for what I had been. I wanted to be known for who I was. Richard's family, on the other hand, was different. They were respectable people, established, the kind who took pride in their name and made sure others knew it. His father, Harold, had spent decades working in federal contracting. He carried himself like a man who had earned every ounce of his success and expected acknowledgement for it. The first time I met him, he shook my hand firmly and looked me up and down in a way that felt more like an evaluation than a greeting. "So he said, Richard tells me you've had a quiet career." I smiled politely. "I suppose you could say that." He nodded, but there was something behind his eyes. Curiosity maybe, or doubt. I had seen that look before. Over the next few months, as Richard and I grew closer, Harold's tone didn't change. He wasn't openly rude, not at first. But there were comments. Small ones, careful ones. The kind that could be brushed off if you didn't want to make a scene. I imagine retirement must be easier when expectations weren't too high to begin with. You've done well for yourself, considering. Richard's always had a generous heart. I learned to let them pass. At my age, you learn which battles are worth fighting, and which ones aren't. Richard didn't see it. Or maybe he saw pieces of it but didn't understand the full picture. He loved his father, respected him. And Harold wasn't used to being challenged. So I chose peace. When Richard proposed, it was simple. We were sitting on my porch watching the sun settle into the water. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small box, and said, "I don't want to spend whatever time I have left without you." There was no grand speech, no audience, just honesty. I said yes. Planning the wedding brought the families together more often. That's when the tension became harder to ignore. Harold began asking more direct questions. "What exactly did you do in government? Was it administrative work policy? And your pension, is it sufficient?" I answered carefully, always respectfully. "I worked in operations. It was a long career. I'm comfortable." But it wasn't enough for him. He wanted specifics. He wanted something he could measure. Something he could place on his internal scale of worth. One afternoon during a planning lunch, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, Evelyn, a marriage isn't just about companionship. It's about standing, about reputation." I met his gaze calmly. "I agree." He nodded satisfied for a moment, then added, "I just want to be sure my son isn't settling." The table went quiet. Richard shifted in his seat. "Dad." But I placed my hand gently over Richard's. "It's all right," I said softly. And it was. Not because his words didn't matter, but because I had spent a lifetime learning that people often reveal more about themselves than they intend. Still, I could feel it building. The unspoken judgment. The assumptions. The quiet dismissal. And I knew sooner or later it would surface. Not in private, but where it would matter most. Looking back now, I realize I had a choice. I could have told them everything. Laid it all out. My career, my rank, my history. I could have ended the questions before they even began. But that wouldn't have changed who they were. And it wouldn't have shown me who they truly were either. So I stayed silent. And I waited. Because respect that depends on titles isn't respect at all. And on the day of my wedding, I would finally see just how far that truth would go. By the week of the wedding, I had learned something I think most people discover eventually. If they live long enough, not every family greets change with warmth, even when they call it happiness. Richard and I were getting married on a Saturday in late May in a small Episcopal church near the waterfront. Nothing extravagant. Fresh flowers, a reception at the local yacht club, and a guest list mostly made up of family old friends and people from the community who had known one or both of us for years. It was the sort of wedding people our age appreciate, elegant, without fuss, warm, without spectacle. That was what I wanted. At my age, a wedding isn't about proving anything. It isn't about a grand entrance or a dramatic display. It's about making a promise with clear eyes and a grateful heart. Richard understood that. He wanted the same thing I did, a peaceful day, a meaningful ceremony, and the comfort of beginning a new chapter without pretending we were 25. But peace, I was beginning to understand, was not something Harold intended to offer me. The trouble with men like him is not that they're loud. Loud men can be dealt with. You know where they stand. You hear them coming. The difficult ones are the polished men, the respectable men, the ones who smile while they diminish you, and then act surprised when you notice. Harold had perfected that style over a lifetime. 3 days before the wedding, Richard and I drove to his parents' house for a small family dinner. His mother, Diane, had made pot roast and green beans, and the dining room looked exactly as it always had. China cabinet, polished table runner, pressed silverware laid out with the care of people raised to believe that proper manners could hold a family together. Diane herself was gentle but quiet in the way some women become after decades of accommodating a stronger personality. She was never unkind to me. In fact, I think she liked me. But liking someone and standing up for them are not always the same thing. Richard's younger sister Marianne was there too, along with her husband Kent. Marianne was pleasant enough, though she carried a kind of social alertness that made her seem always to be measuring the room. Kent was one of those men who spoke very little until he had something sharp to say. Dinner started smoothly. Diane asked about the flowers. Marianne wanted to know whether I had chosen ivory or white for my dress. Richard talked about the seating chart. For nearly 20 minutes the meal felt normal. Then Harold set down his water glass and turned to me. "So, Evelyn," he said with that polished tone of his I've been meaning to ask, "what was your title exactly?" The table quieted. I cut a small piece of roast and answered the same way I had before. I worked in naval operations. "That's not really a title," he said. "No," I replied calmly, "it's not." He gave a short laugh as if I had confirmed something for him. Well, I suppose some jobs are harder to explain than others. Richard looked up. "Dad." What Harold said, lifting his hand slightly, "I'm making conversation." But he wasn't. We all knew that. I sipped my iced tea and let the moment pass. That was one of the habits service had taught me better than anything else. Silence can be its own form of control. You do not answer every provocation. You do not rise to every baited line. Sometimes you let a person keep talking until they show everyone at the table exactly who they are. Harold turned to Richard. "I'm just surprised, that's all. A man ought to know the details before marriage." Richard's face tightened. "I know enough." Harold looked at him for a long second. "Do you?" Diane immediately reached for the breadbasket as if dinner could be rescued by carbohydrates. "Who wants another roll?" No one answered. I set down my fork and met Harold's eyes. Richard knows what matters. His expression sharpened just slightly. "That depends on your definition of matters." There it was again. Not quite an insult, not quite a question. Just enough poison to settle into the conversation without making a stain anyone else felt obligated to clean up. Marianne cleared her throat. "Dad, really?" But Harold was in no mood to retreat. "I'm only saying," he continued, "that marriage is serious, at our age especially. Finances, background stability, these aren't things you gloss over." Richard pushed back from the table a little. "We haven't glossed over anything." Harold gave a thin smile. "You say that now?" I could feel the heat of everyone's discomfort spreading through the room, but inside myself I stayed cool. That had always been my refuge. Calm is not the absence of feeling. It is the decision not to let feeling drive the ship. "I've done very well taking care of myself," I said. Harold nodded slowly. "I'm sure you believe that." The words hung there. Marianne stared at her plate. Kent reached for his drink and said nothing. Diane looked stricken. Richard was halfway between anger and embarrassment, which is an unhappy place for a grown son to be. And in that moment I understood something important. Harold did not simply disapprove of me. He resented the fact that I would not present myself for inspection. Men like him are comfortable with resumes. They understand pedigree, salary, job titles, family background. Those things help them sort people into categories that make them feel secure. But a woman who remains self-contained, who answers politely without volunteering more than she chooses, unsettles them. She cannot be ranked so easily. That was what bothered him. Not my past. My refusal to place it in his hands. After dinner, while Diane and Marianne cleared the table, I stepped out onto the back patio for air. The evening was mild, the sky washed in that soft, golden light you get just before sunset. Their yard backed up to a stretch of trees, and for a moment all I could hear were birds and the distant hum of traffic. Richard came out a minute later and closed the screen door behind him. "I'm sorry," he said. I leaned against the railing. "You don't need to apologize for your father's manners." "Yes, I do." He rubbed the back of his neck. "He's been worse than usual." I looked at him. "Has he?" Richard let out a tired breath and gave me a sheepish look. "No, probably not. I just kept hoping he'd settle down." I smiled, though there was sadness in it. People don't usually become kinder because there's a wedding. He looked away, then back at me. "You could tell me, you know." "Tell you what?" "Whatever it is you're not saying." His voice was gentle, not accusing. "I've never pushed because I didn't want to pry, but sometimes I feel like there's this whole part of your life standing quietly behind you, and I'm the only one in the room who can't see it." That touched me more deeply than Harold's barbs ever could. I folded my hands in front of me. "Richard, there are parts of my life I don't talk about because I spent years living in places where talking too much wasn't wise, and after a while privacy becomes less of a habit and more of a comfort." "I know," he said, "but I'm not your commanding officer. I'm the man marrying you." There was pain in his voice, and that pained me. So I stepped closer and rested my hand on his arm. "And I love you for your heart, not your questions." He covered my hand with his. "That's not an answer." "No," I said softly, "it isn't." We stood there together for a few seconds in the fading light. Then I said the only thing I could say honestly. "There are things I will tell you, but I want to do it in my own time." Richard studied my face, then nodded. "All right." It was one of the reasons I loved him. He knew how to leave a door open without forcing it wider. Inside, I could hear Diane calling that dessert was ready. We went back in together. Harold was sitting at the head of the table as if nothing had happened, which was his specialty. Men who wound people often prefer to act as though the wound is imaginary. The next day brought more of the same. At the final meeting with the reception coordinator, Harold questioned the guest list, the seating chart, even the choice of music. Every objection of his somehow circled back to me. "Do you know these people well enough to invite them? Are you sure your side isn't a little sparse? I suppose second marriages are always harder to organize." He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His contempt was refined, polished smooth by decades of practice. And still I held my tongue. Not because I was weak, not because I was afraid, but because age teaches you that timing matters. There is a difference between defending yourself and revealing someone else. One is impulse, the other is truth. By Friday night, the evening before the wedding, I was alone in my guest room at Richard's house, laying out the blue silk dress I would wear to the rehearsal dinner. My garment bag for the wedding hung nearby. On the dresser sat a small jewelry box, and inside it, wrapped in tissue, was an item I had not worn in years. I opened the box and looked at it for a long moment. Then I closed it again. Not yet. Outside the room, I could hear low voices, Richard on the phone, Diane moving dishes in the kitchen, Harold talking somewhere down the hall. The house was full of that tense, overmanaged quiet families create when they are trying to force harmony before a major event. I sat down on the edge of the bed and smoothed the dress over my knees. I had spent a lifetime in rooms where pressure could turn a situation dangerous in seconds. Compared to that, a difficult family wedding should have been simple. And yet I felt it deep in my bones. Something was coming. Harold wasn't finished. He had been building toward something all week, testing boundaries, probing for weakness, trying to place me beneath him in whatever invisible hierarchy he carried around in his mind. And tomorrow, with a room full of witnesses and nowhere left for courtesy to hide, I suspected he would finally say exactly what he thought of me. I also suspected he would regret it. I woke before dawn on my wedding day, the way I used to wake before inspections, before briefings, before flights out over uncertain water. Old habits remain in the body long after the uniform is folded away. For a few quiet minutes I lay still and listened to the house settle around me. Pipes clicked faintly in the walls. Somewhere downstairs a floorboard creaked. Outside a gull cried over the water. Virginia mornings near the coast have a softness to them in late May, a gray-blue light that makes everything feel held in suspension, as if the day has not yet decided what it means to become. I remember thinking before my feet even touched the floor that this would be one of those days a person carries forever. Not because of the flowers or photographs, and not because of the cake or music. Those things matter in the moment, but they fade. What lasts is how people reveal themselves when emotion rises and the room is watching. By 8 o'clock, the house was gently alive. Diane moved through the kitchen in her robe, making coffee for everyone and pretending she wasn't nervous. Marianne arrived with garment bags, hairpins, and a voice an octave too bright. Richard had left early for the church with Kent, and I was grateful for that. I needed the morning to gather myself. My dress was simple and elegant ivory silk with long sleeves and a modest neckline. At our age, there is a dignity in not trying to reclaim youth. I didn't want to look young. I wanted to look like myself at peace. As Marianne zipped the back for me, she caught my eyes in the mirror. "You look beautiful," she said. "Thank you." She hesitated, then added quietly, "I'm sorry about Dad." I turned slightly. "That's kind of you." Her face tightened. "He gets fixed on things." "Yes," I said, "I've noticed." She gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "Once he decides he understands a person, he doesn't really leave room to be wrong." That was one of the truest things anyone in that family had said. I studied her reflection for a moment and saw not just discomfort but fatigue. Children of strong fathers often spend years learning how to manage a weather system they did not create. "You don't have to carry responsibility for him," I told her. She lowered her eyes. "Maybe not, but somehow we all do." That stayed with me. The ceremony itself was lovely. The church was small, white, and full of warm morning light. Friends from town filled the pews. Richard stood at the front, looking handsome and a little overwhelmed, his gray suit pressed perfectly, his hands clasped too tightly. When he saw me step into the aisle, his whole face changed. Not dramatically, just softly. His shoulders eased. His mouth trembled into a smile that held gratitude and disbelief all at once. That expression alone would have been enough to carry me through the day. The minister spoke simply without flourish. Richard's voice caught when he said his vows. Mine remained steady, though I felt more than I showed. I had stood in rooms with secretaries, senators, foreign officers, and battle groups hanging on my words. Yet nothing in my professional life had ever felt as intimate as promising one man before God and family that I would walk beside him for whatever years remained to us. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, the church rose in applause. Richard kissed me gently. For a few precious moments, everything Harold had said and implied over the past months faded into the background. The only thing that felt real was the ring on my hand and the warmth of Richard's palm against mine. I wish that had lasted. The reception was held at a yacht club overlooking the water. It wasn't as grand as the name suggests, more old local prestige than modern luxury. Polished wood floors, white tablecloths, brass fixtures framed regatta photographs on the walls. The kind of place where retirees hold anniversary parties and civic boards gather for fundraisers. Comfortable, tasteful, familiar. By early afternoon, the room was full of laughter, clinking glasses, and the easy hum of conversation. The food was good. A trio played standards in the corner. People came up to our table with stories, blessings, warm handshakes. For a while, I let myself believe Harold might preserve the day after all. He moved through the room with his usual confidence, greeting old contacts, shaking hands, patting backs. To anyone who didn't know him well, he looked like a proud father hosting a family celebration. That was part of what made men like Harold difficult. They often save their sharpest edges for private moments, or for moments when social pressure protects them. I noticed he'd had more than one drink, though not enough to slur, just enough to loosen whatever restraint he usually wore. When it came time for speeches, Richard stood first. He thanked everyone for coming, thanked Diane for helping with the arrangements, thanked Marianne for stepping in wherever needed. Then he turned to me. His words were brief and heartfelt. He said that meeting me had made the second half of his life feel unexpectedly full. He said I brought steadiness to his days and joy to his home. He said love at our age wasn't smaller than young love, it was deeper because it arrived carrying memory loss and choice. There wasn't a dry eye at our table. I squeezed his hand when he sat down. Then Harold rose. He lifted his glass and smiled, waiting for the room to settle. His posture was relaxed, practiced. He had likely imagined himself at the center of this moment for weeks. Well, he began, "This is certainly a memorable day." There were a few polite chuckles. I've watched my son walk through some hard years, he continued. Losing a wife changes a man. It leaves him vulnerable in ways he may not even recognize. I felt Richard shift beside me. Harold went on. So when a new person comes along later in life, naturally a father asks questions. The smile on his face remained, but his eyes had sharpened. A few guests looked between us, sensing some current under the words. And I'll admit he said I had my concerns. Richard set down his fork. Dad. Harold waved a hand lightly, still smiling. No, hear me out. I'm speaking honestly. That's what families should do. A murmur passed through the room. Diane stared at the tablecloth. Harold turned slightly enough to include me without fully facing me. You see, Evelyn has always been something of a mystery to us. I sat very still. She's private, he said. Very private, which in itself is fine. But when a woman enters a family and keeps so much hidden, people naturally wonder what exactly is being hidden. The room had gone almost silent now. Somewhere near the back a glass was set down too hard. Richard stood halfway. That's enough. But Harold continued, his voice a little stronger now, a little less polished. My son is a decent man. A trusting man. Maybe too trusting. And I'll say what others may have been too polite to say when someone appears out of nowhere with vague stories about government work and a quiet life. A man is entitled to ask whether she's there for love or for security. The words hit the room like a slap. I heard Marianne suck in a breath. Diane looked as if she might cry. Several guests turned toward me immediately, not with suspicion, but with the helpless attention people give a person who has just been publicly struck. Richard pushed back his chair and stood. You need to stop. Right now. Harold flushed with the terrible courage of a man who mistakes an audience for agreement, pressed on. I'm only protecting my son. If that embarrasses anyone, so be it. Then he looked directly at me. For all we know, he said you spent your career pushing papers in some office and learned just enough to make yourself sound important. But this family doesn't owe respect based on vague hints and polished manners. The silence that followed was unlike ordinary silence. It had weight, shame, shock, the sound of 100 people realizing together that something had gone too far. Richard turned to me horrified. Evelyn. But I placed my hand gently over his wrist. It's all right, I said. And strangely it was, because humiliation only works when you accept the measure being used against you. Harold thought he was stripping something away from me, but he could only strip away the illusion he had built for others. He had no access to what I actually was. I rose slowly from my seat. Not angrily, not dramatically. Just calmly. Every eye in the room followed me. Harold's face was flushed, but I could see the first hint of uncertainty flicker there. Bullies count on immediate collapse, not composure. They know what to do with tears. They know what to do with shouting. Calm confuses them. I looked at him and said in an even voice, You are entitled to your opinions, Harold, but you are not entitled to invent my life simply because I declined to perform it for your approval. A few people lowered their eyes. A few others nodded almost imperceptibly. Harold gave a brittle laugh. Then perhaps you'd like to enlighten us. There it was, the invitation, public, smug, and poisoned. I could have answered then. I could have ended everything with one sentence. Instead, I said no, I don't think I need to. That unsettled him more than anger would have. He opened his mouth again, perhaps to say something even crueler, when the doors at the back of the reception room opened. At first, no one paid much attention. Just another late guest, perhaps. But then the room's focus shifted in a way I recognized instantly. Heads turned not from curiosity but from the subtle force of authority entering a space. A tall man in a dark suit stepped inside, silver-haired, straight-backed, carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. Two others followed behind him, though they remained a respectful distance back. Harold's expression changed. Only slightly, but enough. He knew him. And as the man moved through the parted crowd, his gaze fixed not on Harold, not on Richard, but on me, I realized that the day Harold had worked so hard to control had finally slipped beyond his reach. The room seemed to hold its breath as the man approached. I recognized him immediately, though it had been years since we had last stood in the same room. Time had etched deeper lines into his face, and his hair had gone fully silver, but his posture hadn't changed. It never would. Men like him don't forget who they are even when the uniform comes off. Rear Admiral Thomas Whitaker, Harold's superior, and once long ago, mine in a different chain of command. He walked past tables of guests who instinctively moved aside, though most of them didn't understand why. There's a certain presence that doesn't need explanation. It's felt not announced. When he reached me, he stopped, straightened. And then, in one smooth, unmistakable motion, he raised his hand in a formal salute. "Good morning, Admiral." You could have heard a pin drop. The words didn't echo, but they carried, across every table, through every whispered assumption, into every corner of that room where people had just watched me be measured and dismissed. For a moment, I didn't move. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I understood exactly what this moment meant. Then quietly, I returned the salute. "Good morning, Tom," I said. Not loudly, not for effect. Just enough. A ripple passed through the room, sharp inhales, chairs, shifting the soft clatter of someone setting down a glass too quickly. I turned slightly and looked at Harold. His face had drained of color completely now. The confidence, the authority he had worn like a well-tailored jacket all afternoon, it was gone. In its place was something far more honest. Shock. And beneath it, fear. His mouth opened, then closed. No words came out. That more than anything told me he understood. Whitaker lowered his hand and gave me a small, respectful nod. Then, as if remembering where he was, he glanced around the room. "I apologize for arriving unannounced," he said, addressing no one in particular. "I was informed of the event late, but I felt it would be appropriate to attend." His eyes flickered briefly toward Harold. There was no hostility there. Just clarity. Harold swallowed hard. "Admiral, I didn't realize." Whitaker's expression didn't change. "No," he said calmly. "You didn't." That was all. No reprimand, no raised voice. But it landed heavier than anything Harold had said all day. I could feel every eye on me now. Not curious anymore. Not skeptical. Something else. Recognition, perhaps? Or the uneasy awareness that they had just witnessed something shift in a way they couldn't take back. Richard stood beside me completely still. "Evelyn," he said quietly. I turned to him. There was no accusation in his face, no anger. Only confusion, and something like awe. I reached for his hand. "I was going to tell you," I said softly. "I know," he replied. And I believed him. Whitaker stepped slightly to the side, giving me space but remaining present like a silent anchor in the room. One of the guests, an older gentleman I recognized from town, leaned toward another and whispered not quite quietly enough, "Did he say, Admiral?" The answer came not in words, but in the way the room had already changed. People were sitting straighter now, listening differently. Even those who didn't fully understand military ranks knew enough to recognize the significance. Harold, however, understood exactly. He took a step toward me, then stopped halfway as if unsure whether he had the right to come any closer. "Evelyn," he said, his voice unsteady, I had no idea." I met his eyes. "I know," I said. That was the truth. He hadn't known, but he had assumed. And that had been the real problem all along. Diane rose slowly from her seat, her hand pressed lightly to her chest. "My goodness," she whispered. "All this time." Marianne looked between me and Whitaker, her expression somewhere between disbelief and realization. Kent for once had nothing to say at all. Harold tried again. "If I'd known—" I stopped him gently but firmly. "If you'd known I said, you would have treated me differently." He hesitated. "Yes," he admitted. "And that I said is exactly why I didn't tell you." The room absorbed that. Not just Harold. Everyone. Because what I had said wasn't complicated. But it was undeniable. Whitaker folded his hands behind his back, his posture relaxed but precise. "Admiral Carter," he said, turning slightly toward the room, served with distinction for over 3 decades. She commanded operations most people in this room will never hear about, and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. I felt a flicker of discomfort at that. I had never been one for public praise. "Tom," I said quietly. He inclined his head, just stating facts. Then he added more gently, "Facts that should have been recognized long before today." Harold flinched. I took a slow breath. This was the moment I realized not the salute, not the revelation, but what came after. This was where things could turn into something bitter. Or something better. I looked around the room. At the guests who had watched in silence. At Diane, who looked ashamed. At Marianne, who looked thoughtful. At Richard, who looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time and yet somehow more clearly than ever. And finally back at Harold. His shoulders had lowered. His certainty was gone. In its place was something I hadn't seen before. Humility. I didn't keep my past a secret to deceive anyone. I said, my voice calm but steady enough to carry. I kept it private because I wanted to live the rest of my life as a person, not as a rank. No one interrupted. I've spent years in rooms where titles mattered, where authority had to be clear, where decisions had consequences that couldn't be undone. I paused. But this, I gestured lightly around the room, this was supposed to be different. My gaze settled on Harold again. This was supposed to be about family. Harold's eyes dropped. I was wrong, he said. The words came out quietly. Not polished. Not practiced. Just real. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Diane moved first. She stepped toward me, her eyes filled with something soft and regretful. Evelyn, she said, I'm so sorry. I should have said something. I reached out and touched her hand. You're saying it now. That seemed to matter to her. Richard finally exhaled a breath he'd been holding far too long. Well, he said with a faint disbelieving smile, I guess I should have asked a few more questions. A light ripple of laughter moved through the room, not mocking, not sharp, but relieved. The tension cracked. Just a little. Whitaker stepped back slightly, his role in the moment complete. I'll leave you to your celebration, he said. I nodded. Thank you for coming. He gave me one last respectful look. Always Admiral. Then he turned and walked back through the room, the quiet authority he carried, leaving a different kind of silence behind him. As the doors closed, the weight in the room shifted again. Not gone. But changed. What had been humiliation was now something else. Reckoning. Understanding. And perhaps the beginning of something better. Harold remained where he stood, still processing. Then slowly, almost as if it cost him something, he took another step toward me. This time he didn't stop. And for the first time since I had met him, he looked at me not as someone to evaluate, but as someone he needed to understand. For a while after the doors closed behind Admiral Whitaker, no one seemed quite sure what to do next. The music had stopped at some point I hadn't even noticed when, and the trio in the corner sat quietly with their instruments resting in their laps, waiting for someone to signal that it was all right to begin again. Glasses remained half raised. Conversations hung unfinished. Moments like that don't resolve all at once. They settle slowly like dust after something has been shaken loose. Richard was still standing beside me, his hand wrapped firmly around mine now, as if he needed to anchor himself to something steady. You were a Navy admiral, he said quietly. I nodded, yes. He let out a soft breath, not quite a laugh. That's not exactly small detail. No, I agreed, it isn't. He studied my face, searching not for answers, I realized, but for reassurance. Why didn't you tell me, he asked? There was no accusation in it, just hurt and curiosity. I turned slightly so we were facing each other fully, even though the room was still watching. Because I wanted you to see me, I said, not what I used to be. His brow furrowed. I do see you. I know, I said gently, but I needed to know that first. That seemed to settle something in him. He nodded slowly, you're right. And then after a pause he added, I just wish I had known what you were carrying. That word stayed with me. Carrying. Because that's what a life like mine becomes eventually. Not a badge, not a title. A weight. Around us the room began to stir again. Not loudly, not abruptly, but carefully. A few guests resumed quiet conversations. Chairs shifted. Someone signaled to the musicians and soft piano notes began to fill the space again, gentle and unobtrusive. But the atmosphere had changed. People were looking at me differently now. Not just with curiosity. With respect. And in some cases with a kind of distance that hadn't been there before. That more than anything was what I had always tried to avoid. Diane approached again, this time more composed. Evelyn, she said, I can't imagine the responsibility you must have carried all those years. I smiled faintly. It wasn't something I carried alone. She nodded, though I wasn't sure she fully understood. Few people outside that world ever do. Marianne stepped forward next. "I feel like I owe you an apology too," she said. "For what?" "For not seeing what was happening. Or maybe seeing it and not saying anything." I considered that. Then I shook my head. "You're not responsible for someone else's behavior." She gave a small, thoughtful nod. "I still wish I had said something," she admitted. "That's fair," I said. And it was. Across the room I saw Harold still standing near his chair. He hadn't moved much since the moment everything changed. His glass sat untouched in his hand. He wasn't looking at me now. He was looking down. I had seen that posture before too. Not in men who had been defeated, but in men who had just realized they had been wrong. There's a difference. Defeat closes a man. Understanding opens him. After a few minutes, he finally walked toward us. Not with his usual confidence. Not with that careful, measured authority he carried like a second skin. Just slowly. When he reached us, he didn't speak right away. He set his glass down on the nearest table, cleared his throat, then looked at me directly. "I owe you an apology," he said. The room quieted again, not completely, but enough that those closest could hear. "I spoke out of turn," he continued, "and out of assumption." I held his gaze. "Yes," I said. He didn't flinch. "I judged you based on what I didn't know," he went on. "And instead of asking with respect, I pushed. I made it public when it should have remained private." There was no defensiveness in his voice now. No justification. Just acknowledgement. That matters more than most people realize. "I appreciate you saying that," I told him. He nodded once. Then, after a pause, he added, "If I had known who you were." I shook my head gently. "That's not the point." He stopped. And for the first time, I saw him really listening. "The problem isn't that you didn't know my rank," I said. "The problem is that you believed respect should depend on it." The words were quiet, but they carried. He absorbed that slowly. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, "You're right." That couldn't have been easy for him. Men like Harold build their lives on certainty. Admitting fault isn't just uncomfortable, it's disorienting. I spent my entire career in a system where rank mattered, I continued. It had to. People needed to know who was responsible, who made decisions, who answered for outcomes. He nodded slightly. "But outside of that system," I said, "rank is just a word. It doesn't define who a person is." I let that sit for a moment. "Character does." Harold looked down again, then back up. "And I misjudged yours," he said. "Yes," I replied. There was no need to soften it. Truth doesn't require decoration. He exhaled slowly. "I won't pretend I can undo what I said," he admitted, "but I would like the chance to do better." That more than the apology itself told me something had shifted. Because doing better requires more than regret. It requires change. I studied him for a moment. Then I nodded. That's all anyone can ask. There was a small release in the room after that. Not dramatic, but real. Conversations resumed more naturally. The music picked up a little. Someone laughed at something across the room, and it didn't feel out of place anymore. Richard squeezed my hand. "You handled that better than I would have," he said quietly. I smiled. "That's why you married me." He chuckled softly, among other reasons. As the afternoon continued, people approached me one by one. Some offered congratulations. Some asked respectful questions about my service. Others simply shook my hand and said nothing at all. I answered what I chose to answer, and left the rest where it belonged, in the past. But through it all, one thing remained clear in my mind. Respect that arrives only after revelation is not the same as respect that exists from the beginning. And yet sometimes it's the only kind people are capable of at first. What matters is whether they learn to offer it without conditions. As I looked around the room at Richard, at Diane, at Marianne, and even at Harold now speaking more quietly than I had ever seen him, I realized something I hadn't expected. This day hadn't just revealed who I was. It had revealed who they were. And more importantly, who they might still become. By the time the sun had begun to lower over the marina, the reception had softened into something quieter and more honest than it had been all afternoon. The shock had worn off. The whispers had thinned. People were no longer looking at me with that startled, searching expression they'd had after Admiral Whitaker's salute. They were looking at me more normally now, though, perhaps with a little more care than before. I was grateful for that. I had no desire to spend the rest of my wedding day as a spectacle. Richard and I had managed one slow dance, just one. The band was playing an old standard something from the 60s, warm and familiar, and we moved carefully across the floor with the kind of restraint that comes from years, not from lack of feeling. His hand rested lightly at my back. My head was near his shoulder. Neither of us spoke for the first minute or so. Finally, he said, "I keep replaying the whole day in my mind." "That's usually a sign of shock," I said. He gave a quiet laugh. "That obvious?" "A little." We kept moving. Then he said more seriously, "I'm not upset that you were an admiral." "I certainly hope not." That brought another small laugh from him. "I'm upset," he said, "that you felt you had to carry that alone." I drew back just enough to see his face. It wasn't about carrying it alone. Then what was it about? I took a breath. It was about leaving it where it belonged. He studied me, listening. "When you spend years in command," I said, "people stop seeing the person and start seeing the structure around her. The rank, the authority, the expectations. Even after retirement, it follows you. People either stiffen around you or perform for you. I didn't want that with you." "And you thought telling me would change that?" "I didn't know," I said honestly, "but I knew I didn't want to begin our life together inside a title I had already spent a lifetime carrying." Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "I can understand that." I smiled a little. "You don't have to understand all of it." "I know," he said, "but I'd like to understand more than I did this morning." That touched me. So I rested my head against his shoulder again and let the music carry us the rest of the way through the song. When it ended, he kissed my temple and said, "Whatever you tell me from here on out, tell me because you want to, not because anyone forced the moment." That was Richard all over. A decent man in an indecent moment, still trying to make room for grace. A little later, after coffee had been served and the cake had been cut, I stepped outside to the club's back terrace for air. The evening was cool and clear. The water beyond the railing had turned a deep blue-gray, and boat masts rocked gently in the slips below. From inside came the softened sound of conversation and silverware blurred now by glass and distance. I stood there for a minute by myself, one hand resting on the railing, letting the quiet settle my nerves. "I thought I might find you out here." I turned. Harold stood in the open doorway. For once he did not look like a man entering a room he expected to control. He looked older than he had that morning, not frail, just stripped of some invisible armor. I didn't speak, I simply waited. He came a few steps closer, then stopped at what felt like a respectful distance. "I won't keep you long," he said. "That would be appreciated." He nodded, accepting that. For a moment he looked out at the water instead of at me. "I've spent most of my life believing I could read people quickly," he said. "It served me well in business." Or so I told myself. I folded my hands loosely in front of me, and today, he gave a humorless little smile, today I found out there's a difference between reading people and sorting them. That was better than I expected from him. He turned to me, then his expression plain, unguarded. "I was cruel to you." "Yes," I said. "I embarrassed my son." "Yes." "I embarrassed myself." I let that sit for a beat. Also yes. For the first time all day, something almost like humility passed between us without resistance. It didn't fix anything, but it cleared the air. He slipped one hand into his pocket and exhaled slowly. "I've been trying to understand why I reacted to you the way I did." "Have you?" "I think so." He looked down briefly, then back at me. "You made me feel irrelevant." That surprised me, not because it was impossible, but because he admitted it. I said nothing, and he went on. "Richard listens to you in a way he stopped listening to me years ago, not out of disrespect, just because he trusts you. And the less you explained yourself, the more I felt shut out. I told myself I was protecting him, but the truth is, I didn't like not being the one with authority. There it was. Not class anxiety, not suspicion, not even disapproval at the core of it. Fear. The ordinary fear of a man aging out of the role he had built his identity around. I had seen versions of that fear before in officers facing retirement and politicians, after elections in men who mistake usefulness for control, and then don't know who they are without it. "It's a hard thing," I said quietly, "to realize the people you love no longer need your permission to build their lives." He nodded, harder than I expected. The honesty in that softened me more than the apology itself had. Harold looked toward the water again. My father was the same sort of man, he said. Maybe harder. In his house, respect meant obedience. You didn't question him. You didn't withhold information. You certainly didn't let him feel small. And now I asked. He gave a tired smile. Now I suppose I handed that legacy right down the line without thinking about it. I leaned back lightly against the railing. That's how it usually happens. He looked at me, then genuinely curious. Why didn't you destroy me in there? It was such a blunt question that I almost smiled. I'm sorry. You could have, he said. The moment Whitaker saluted you, you could have humiliated me in front of everyone, given a speech, told them exactly who I was, exactly what I'd done. I think they already saw. He winced because he knew it was true. But that's not an answer, he said. No, I replied, it isn't. I looked past him for a moment through the window where I could see Richard inside speaking quietly with Diane. Then I looked back at Harold. Revenge is satisfying for about 5 minutes, I said. After that, you still have to live with yourself. He frowned slightly, listening. I learned a long time ago that correction and humiliation are not the same thing. One teaches, the other only spreads damage. The wind shifted lightly across the terrace. Somewhere below us, halyards tapped softly against a mast. Harold's eyes lowered. I don't know if I've done much teaching in my life. Not today, I said. A corner of his mouth twitched despite himself. Fair enough. We stood there in silence for a moment. Then he said more quietly, I was wrong about you. But worse than that, I was wrong in front of people I love. My wife, my daughter, my son. He swallowed. I don't want that to be the last lesson they take from me. That mattered. Because by then I understood what this conversation really was. Not an attempt to erase his shame, not even a plea for forgiveness. It was the first time perhaps in years that Harold was speaking without performing. You can't undo today, I said, but you can decide what kind of man you'll be tomorrow. He nodded once firmly. Then after a pause he said, I'd like the chance to earn your trust. Not because of your rank, because of what you showed me today. That was the closest thing to wisdom I had heard from him. I considered him carefully. Trust at my age is not handed out because someone asks politely, but neither is it withheld forever if change is real. You can start, I said, by speaking to Richard honestly, not as a father giving instruction, as a man admitting fault. I can do that. And to Diane, I added, she's been smoothing over your sharp edges for years. His face shifted. A little shame, a little recognition. Yes, he said, you're right. I usually am. That actually drew a short laugh out of him. Not much, but enough to sound human. He straightened then, not stiffly, but with intention. For what it's worth, Evelyn, your restraint today said more about your character than any title ever could. I met his eyes. That, I said, is the first truly respectful thing you've said to me. He accepted that without protest. Then he gave me a small nod and stepped back toward the doorway. Before he went inside, he turned once more. I am glad my son married you. There was no polish in it. No strategy. Just truth. And because of that, I believed him. After he left, I remained on the terrace for another minute listening to the water and the muffled warmth of the reception behind me. I thought about the strange shape the day had taken, how humiliation had turned into revelation, and revelation into something quieter and harder to earn. Not victory. Not exactly. Something better. Perspective. When I went back inside, Richard looked up immediately and crossed the room to me. You all right? He asked. I am now, I said. He glanced toward the hall where Harold had disappeared a moment earlier. Did he come out here? Yes. And I slipped my hand into his. And I think I said your father may finally be ready to grow up. Richard stared at me for half a second, then laughed, really laughed for the first time all day. And that more than the salute, more than the shocked silence, more than Harold's apology felt like the first clear sign that the worst of the day was behind us. By the time the evening began to wind down, the reception had transformed into something I hadn't expected when the day began. It was quieter, warmer, more honest. The kind of gathering where people leaned in closer when they spoke, where laughter came easier, and where whatever had been shaken loose earlier in the day had settled into something more grounded. The band played softer now. The sky outside had darkened into a deep navy, the kind that reflects faintly off the water like memory rather than light. Guests were beginning to say their goodbyes, lingering hugs, slow handshakes, promises to call to visit, to stay in touch. At our age, you learn that goodbyes are never casual. They carry weight. Richard and I stood near the entrance thanking people as they left. "You gave us quite a story to remember," one of the older gentlemen said to me with a small smile. "I wasn't aiming for that," I replied. He chuckled. "The best stories never are." Another woman squeezed my hand gently. "You handled yourself with such grace." "Thank you," I said. But I knew grace had not been something I woke up with that morning. It had been built over years through discipline, restraint, and the understanding that not every battle deserves to be fought in the moment it appears. Sometimes the most powerful response is patience. Diane approached us once the last of the guests had drifted out. She looked tired but lighter than she had earlier. "I don't think I've ever experienced a day quite like this," she said. "I hope that's not a complaint," I replied gently. She smiled. "No, I think it's a lesson." She turned to Richard, touching his arm briefly, then looked back at me. "I've spent many years keeping peace in this family," she said. "Sometimes that meant staying quiet when I shouldn't have." I listened. "That changes today," she added. There was a quiet strength in her voice I hadn't heard before. And I believed her. A few minutes later, Harold joined us. Not at the head of the room. Not with an audience. Just beside us. He cleared his throat lightly. "Most of the staff is beginning to clean up," he said. "I've already spoken to the manager about the final arrangements." It was such an ordinary statement that for a moment I almost smiled. Because it wasn't about control. It was about contribution. A small shift, but a real one. Then he turned to Richard. "I owe you something as well," he said. Richard looked at him carefully. "You do?" Harold nodded. "I spoke today as if your judgment didn't matter, as if I still had the right to decide what was best for your life." Richard crossed his arms, not defensively but thoughtfully. "I know you meant to protect me," he said. "Yes," Harold replied, "but protection isn't the same as respect." That was a good line. Not perfect, but honest. "I should have trusted you," Harold continued, "and I should have respected the woman you chose without requiring her to prove herself to me." Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he said that would have made today a lot easier. Harold gave a small, rueful nod. Yes, it would have. The three of us stood there together in a kind of stillness that felt new. Not tense. Not fragile. Just unfamiliar. Like a room that had been rearranged after many years and was still settling into its new shape. Finally, Harold looked at me. "I won't pretend I can undo what I did," he said. "But I meant what I said earlier. I would like the chance to do better." I held his gaze. "You'll have that chance," I said. He nodded, accepting that it was not forgiveness, but it was not rejection either. And sometimes that's where real change begins. Later that night, after everything had been cleared and the staff had gone, Richard and I returned to my house by the water. It was quiet again. The kind of quiet I had always loved. He loosened his tie and sat down at the kitchen table, exhaling deeply. "Well," he said, "that wasn't the wedding I expected." "No," I agreed, "it wasn't." He looked at me, a small smile forming. "But I think it might have been the one we needed." I leaned against the counter, considering that. "Yes," I said, "I think you're right." He rested his arms on the table. So he said, "Are there any other surprises I should know about?" I smiled. "No more ranks," I said. "That's a relief," he replied. Then more gently, "But I'd still like to hear about your life, when you're ready." I walked over and sat across from him. "I am ready," I said. And for the first time since we met, I began to tell him. Not everything. Not all at once. But enough. About the years of service. About the decisions. About the people I had led and the ones I had lost. He listened without interruption. Without judgment. Without trying to place it into some category he could control. Just listening. And that more than anything told me I had made the right choice. As the night deepened and the conversation slowed, I stepped out onto my porch one last time. The water was dark and still now. The air carried that familiar coastal chill. I rested my hands on the railing and thought about everything that had happened. The insult. The silence. The salute. The apology. The shift. It would be easy to call it justice. Easy to frame it as a moment where truth prevailed and pride was humbled. But life is rarely that simple. What mattered more wasn't that Harold had been proven wrong. It was that he had been given the chance to see it and choose something better. Because in the end, titles fade. Positions end. Even the strongest reputations soften with time. But character is what remains when everything else is stripped away. I turned back toward the house where Richard waited inside. A new chapter. Not perfect, but real. And if there's anything worth carrying forward from a day like that, it's this. Treat people with respect before you know their story. Not after. Because by the time you discover who they are, it may already be too late to show them who you are. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of a moment in your own life where patience mattered more than pride, or where understanding came later than it should have, then take a moment to reflect on it. Share it with someone who might need that reminder. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about life dignity and the quiet strength we carry, consider subscribing and staying with us. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons are the ones we don't see coming.